This is the Thursday, April 8, 2010 meeting of the Zoning Board of Examiners and Appeals. Will you call the roll, please?
Joanna Croft.
Present.
Holly Sozo. Timothy Bigg.
Here.
Dean Cars.
Here.
Kenneth Burkhart.
Here.
Jeff Ron.
Here.
Joshua Fink. Here. Ann Denny.
Here.
We do not have any meetings in our packet for approval. Moving on the agenda, so that moves us down to special order of business. Item C1, disclosures. Are there any disclosures to announce for this evening? Mr. Burkhart.
Yes, in case H2, I believe, 2010-026, the Chugach Meadows Condo Association, the representative for the petitioner there is with KPB Architects. I'm also one of the principals at KPB Architects, so I'm going to be recusing myself for a potential conflict of interest on that one.
Thank you, Mr. Burkhart. Are there any other disclosures? Ms. Croft.
Yes, in the case H1, case 2010-032, I just noted that that my firm Burkhart Croft has in the past done work for the Alaska Club. We are not presently doing anything with them, and I don't believe that I would have any problem being fair, but I thought I should let you know.
Thank you, Ms. Croft. Are there any other disclosures? I do have a disclosure to announce also on case H2, case 2010-026. My firm was involved with this property, performed some work on that. So for that reason, I intend to recuse myself from that case as well. That case will put us down. Right now we have 7 board members. That will put us down at 5. Mr. Ron will be serving as acting chair. That will make that board we will be in a short board situation, but I understand, Mr. Barrett, that the petitioner wishes to continue.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Al, does that acceptance need to be on the record by the petitioner?
Well, it probably doesn't hurt. I mean, it's in the code that they're given a free pass, so I would assume.
Usually it's offered and accepted or offered and denied.
I think the petitioner is here. They're just out in the lobby, so maybe we could take care of that when we start their case.
Yeah, and there's been a couple, there have been requests for changing the order of the agenda. However, hearing no request from any of the board members, I'm under the impression that we will continue with the cases as set on the agenda. Are there any other disclosures? Seeing none, there are no items on the consent agenda. We have nothing on the E, appearance requests, or F, unfinished business. That moves us to our regular agenda, and we have no resolutions for approval. So that moves us on to our public hearings. I would like to, before we go into the public hearings, provide the order of business for variances. The chair will introduce the case. The board will hear and rule on any objections to the sufficiency of notice. The board will hear a brief staff presentation outlining the case not to exceed 10 minutes. The board may then question the staff. The applicant will give his or her presentation not to exceed 10 minutes. Throughout the proceedings, the burden of proof rests on the applicant to convince the board by a preponderance of evidence that the variance should be granted. After the applicant's presentation, the board and the staff may question the applicant. The staff will have an opportunity to rebut the applicant's presentation not to exceed 3 minutes. The board and the applicant may then question the staff. The applicant will then have an identical opportunity for rebuttal. The hearing will then be open for public testimony. Each person has 3 minutes. After the public hearing, the staff, followed by the applicant, have the right of rebuttal. Then the matter rests with the board. The chair asks for a positive motion from the board. That brings us to our first case this evening, case 2010-032, the petitioner, Alaska Club Partners. Is the petitioner or the representative here this evening? They've indicated they are. Mr. Barrett, since you're the lone ranger over there, I'm assuming this and all cases are yours this evening. Could you provide us with the sufficiency of notice, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This case was advertised and posted, and 192 public hearing notices were mailed out for this case. We did not receive any written responses back for the public hearing notices. We did receive numerous phone calls, though.
Thank you. Would you proceed with your presentation?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a request to reduce the number of required parking spaces below what the code calls for. There are 2 standards to be met, and we'll go over those in detail in a second, but briefly they are that the applicant must demonstrate the parking that he has is sufficient for the uses, and secondly, that he has area for spillover parking so that should something go wrong and he does need the additional parking, he will be able to accommodate it on his own property. The first item, that the need for the parking is not as what is called for in the code, is usually accomplished by means of a parking study or a series of parking counts. And the second item, that spillover parking can be accommodated and not go on to the neighbor's property, is usually indicated on a site plan or plot plan as a vacant area, but showing in a drawing that the required number of parking spaces can be accommodated. The applicant has provided those documents to us. There is an as-built of the existing property on page 3 of the package, an aerial on page 2, and the proposal showing some new tennis courts and some overflow parking on page 4 of the report. This property has a fairly long history. It's been an existing building with existing parking, and as far back as we can go in building permits, we can find 240 parking spaces indicated as required for the building that was in place at the time. There's no indication of how the 240 calculation was arrived at. Gymnasiums, rec centers, and health clubs were not a specific item in the code at that time. Parking requirements were usually just based on the most similar use. Regardless, we were not able to make the numbers match up. Square footage of the building divided by X number of spaces required per square feet. We could not duplicate the 240 number. Nevertheless, it's there and it's working. There was a later building addition that was built under the current parking requirement of 1 parking space per 300 square feet of building. That was an 11,000 square 4-foot addition and required 38 new parking spaces. That brings us to the existing situation for the building, which is a total of about 99,000 square feet and a total of 278 parking spaces. Now, if that building had been built today, it would have required 330 parking spaces approximately. The applicant has estimated that if that building were built today based on the parking generation he has seen, it would only have required 245, or perhaps I should say he would have been able to demonstrate that he could make a case for only 245 parking spaces being required. There are, as I say, 278 spaces on the property, and there is a small chart in the middle of page 6 which indicates the various sizes of the buildings, the additions, how much parking was required per code, and what the applicant estimates would have actually been needed. In any case, we have a 99,000 square foot building and 278 spaces of parking. The applicant is now proposing to add 2 new tennis courts which will be in an enclosed structure of just over 14,000 square feet. Strictly speaking, by the code, that 14,000-foot structure, because it is enclosed, requires 48 new parking spaces. If the structure was not there, if it were only 2 new tennis courts, we might not have any parking requirement. We haven't been into that in a lot of detail within the department in our own discussions. But the decision that the structure being an enclosing structure of 14,000 square feet would, by the letter, have to meet the code, and that's 48 new spaces. The applicant believes he could make do with only 4 new parking spaces. Using the ITE traffic generation manual, it's a lot of interpolation, but it appears that 8 parking spaces would be required if we went by the code, if we went by the ITE manual. What the applicant is asking for is that the new tennis courts in the enclosed structure not be required to provide any new parking, and that the total parking remain at what it is now, 279 spaces. Excuse me. So on to the 2 standards. Standard 1, that the variance for the number of parking spaces shall be granted on the basis of the demonstrated need for parking. The intent here is that the applicant is able to demonstrate that the current code requirement is not accurate as it pertains to his use and property. This is normally met, as mentioned before, by use of some kind of a traffic or parking study. The department believes that this standard is met. The parking study was actually not a true long-term parking study. It was a series of parking counts over a period of a couple of weeks. However, the applicant has stated that over the years, they have fairly closely monitored the parking, and they have never seen all 279 spaces filled. As I mentioned at the start, no public hearing notices were returned, but we did get a lot of telephone calls, and of those calls, only 1 or 2 people, as I recall, said that they thought the parking was a problem and that there was spillover parking. The idea further in support of this standard being met, the idea that 2 tennis courts with no spectator seating would have a code requirement of 48 parking spaces does sound a little bit excessive. If both courts were fully occupied, playing doubles, that would be 16 people. I don't play tennis. So it just seems that the idea for 48 parking spaces is a little bit excessive. The traffic department and the planning department do believe that standard 1 has been met as conditioned. Standard 2, that spillover parking can be accommodated and spillover onto other private property will be avoided. That standard is met on his proposed drawing, which was back on page 4. The applicant has indicated an area labeled overflow where he can provide for 54 future spaces should they be needed, and that's more than enough to accommodate the code requirement of 48. The department believes that both standards have been satisfied and recommends that the parking reduction be approved. No new spaces will be required, and the existing parking of 279 spaces will be maintained. There are 3 conditions on pages 8 and 9. Should the board find for approval, and I'll mention that the reason I was being specific about the number of parking spaces being maintained is that there will be a change to the parking arrangement. The layout of all the parking is going to be changed a bit. The 2 new tennis courts are going to displace some of it, but it can be related, it can be retained on site, and the number of spaces will be the same. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett. Are there any questions of staff at the board? Ms. Croft.
Just a small point of clarification. You said 278 and 279. I just want to be sure what the current count is.
Mr. Chairman, Ms. Croft, I'll ask the applicant to verify it, but I believe it's 278 that he has. In my rounding, I may have come up with 279 from another count. And I'm afraid the print on the drawings might be a little small for me to read. If we could, I'd like to rely on the applicant.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any other questions of staff? Seeing none, would the applicant come forward? And could you state and spell your name for the record, please?
My name is Don Dwiggins, D-W-I-G-G-I-N-S. I'm an architect and I represent the client. To the question of the count, the 278 is the official required parking today based on the original 240 plus the 38 that were required by the addition that were done a number of years ago. So that's the 278. There are 279 actual spaces, so we exceed the requirement by one.
And Mr. Dwiggins, if I could, I appreciate that for addressing that comment. Just for the record, you have 10 minutes for your presentation, and we have to find that both standards are met, so if you'll...
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Barrett. That was a wonderful presentation. It covers most of my points. There are 279 spaces. The courts will displace 34 spaces, and it would reduce the count to 243, which by my calculations, there's a couple of locations, page 37 and also page 6, I believe, that show how when you evaluate the tennis courts based on their actual use, it's a bad standard because there's such a huge volume of square footage for such a few occupants. And so when I do my analysis based on the majority of the building at 1 per 300, I get one number, and then I add the actual count for the tennis courts, and I get a total of about 245 would be all that were required. In the packet, you'll see the numbers that the owner provided for the use of the lot. They have not had parking counts historically, but were requested to do so as part of this, so there was a fairly short window of time they did these counts. But the maximum number of cars in the lot at any time they counted was 156. So there's more than 100 spaces that are vacant majority of the time. Anyway, the bottom line is the current parking is more than adequate. In fact, you could argue that it's excessive. The 48 additional spaces, by common sense, it just tells you that it's inappropriate. The plan we have is to regain the parking that we're losing by the displacement by these courts. And the existing site plan has 279, and the way I've reconfigured the parking by capturing spaces here and there on the site, adding little pockets of parking around the building, putting some parallel parking on the north driveway, reconfiguring the handicap parking around the entry and capturing some spaces in the courtyard, I get back to exactly 279 spaces. So I can put the building on the property and get the same number of parking spaces without having to grow into the forested area that is what would be the spillover area. The neighbors, I'm sure, and the club also do not want to cut that forest down for the benefit of having parking that won't be utilized. So, in fact, we could make the case that we could just build the building, leave the parking at as it is, and just not even do the additional parking back to the 279, kind of see how it shakes out, and then build the count back to 279, and then reevaluate again if we needed to do that. In fact, that would be my preference. Obviously, not having to build all those parking spaces back would be more beneficial than having to do it, at least from a financial standpoint. I think that covers it. I'll leave my time for rebuttal. That's fine.
Thank you, Mr. Dwiggins. Are there any questions of the applicant by the board? Mr. Ron.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Slightly confused here. You mentioned a buffering of trees. Were you discussing the overflow parking directly to the north of the existing structure it looks like some trees will be taken out to the northeast. Is that?
Yeah, we will be reducing the trees on the north boundary, but there'll still be 32 feet of trees between the edge of the pavement and the property line. So we're reducing that by 8 feet or thereabouts.
Thank you.
Mr. Vig.
Mr. Wiggins, I was curious about the club's operations with regard to snow storage in the wintertime. Do parking spaces get covered up with snow plowing and storage of snow that would effectively reduce the number available?
I believe they use some of the parking for snow storage, but it's spaces that aren't utilized, so they are doing that. Robert Brewster is the CEO, and he might be better to address that.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you about that. The snow storage is obviously an issue with any parking lot in Alaska, and we currently store snow in various pockets around the property. We currently do store snow in the east parking lot, very near where this structure would be, and it's our anticipation that we would have to haul a little bit more often, maybe a couple times more per year than we do currently, because we would not want to lose the space that's currently lost to snow storage.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Mr. Burkhart.
Yes. Has this been submitted to the building department for plan review yet, or?
No, we're in the process of doing drawings, but we're kind of going slowly through the process to save costs till we know the variance is approved.
Okay. Have you had any discussions in terms of, it looks like at least part of the parking lots were constructed before landscape ordinance went into effect, and have you discussed with them the need for internal landscaping and whether or not they're going to try to make you bring that up to current code?
Actually, I was thinking about that before I came to the meeting. The east parking lot was redone. That used to be, there used to be less parking there, and they reconfigured that parking lot a number of years ago, and we did go through the internal landscaping at the time so that east parking lot meets that standard, even though it didn't originally. We'll obviously have to address that when we submit plans for the new building, because we'll have to address the site grading and drainage because we're reconfiguring it. We've got to dodge fire hydrants and that sort of thing. So there will be some minor adjustments to our plan once we get into construction drawings. We have not hired a civil engineer yet to do the site grading and drainage. So yeah, we were aware that will be an issue, but it hasn't been totally resolved yet.
Okay. And one last question. On page 9 of the packet, the department recommendations, recommendation number 3 is that no spectator seating associated with the new tennis courts is allowed. So I guess I want to know if you're aware of that you aren't planning any bleachers or anything like that associated on the interior.
We're absolutely aware of that. The building in question is, they own the building already. It happens to be in Juneau, in use. It has no room for spectator seating. You walk in the door, you're on the court. There's not one seat available inside the building. So even the people that would be waiting to play next would be in the main building. They wouldn't even be able to be in the building. They'd be interfering with the play of those who are there.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any other questions of the applicant? Yes, Mr. Ron.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wiggins, I do have one final question. Based on the site plan on page 4, it looks like there will be some type of, whether we call it curb cut or diversion on the east side of that new overflow parking to keep cars from going directly into the adjacent parking lot. Is that the intention? Will the only access remain there in the existing cut?
Well, if I understand the question correctly, I think you're looking at a line that is the property line. There's no barrier there.
Okay.
They use that access constantly. They have an agreement with the neighbors. Everybody comes and goes. They come through this property to get their building and vice versa. So they're good neighbors, and that's been that way forever.
Are there any other questions? Does the staff have any questions of the applicant?
No, thank you.
With that, then, we will open the case for public testimony. Is there anyone from the public wishing to testify? Will you please state and spell your name for the record?
Dan Hobert, Hobert.
Okay, Mr. Hobert, you have 3 minutes.
I'm a neighbor of the Alaska Club. I've lived there for 30 years, I think. And my initial concern was taking away a few parking places and the snow storage, and that sometimes becomes a nighttime problem. But I talked with Mr. Dwiggins, and I've then met with Mr. Barrett and looked at the plan, and then had a meeting with Mr. Brewster at the Alaska Club and Mr. Sossaman. And we had a good meeting, and any problems that might come with the snow removal, we agreed, hey, could be handled. And like I said, I've lived there when it was the Teamsters. That's the only time I've seen when they had real overflow was when the Teamsters had it, and they had a large party one time, and they had friends ask if they could park in my driveway. But I think it would be a detriment to the neighborhood to have to take down trees to make more parking when it's in all probability not necessary. And in the past I've worked with neighbors on different issues around there, and that's always been a big concern of theirs, is to lose that buffer. So after the meetings, and I'm here that I think the variance should be allowed. I would have no objection, and I don't think the other neighbors, they'd rather have that than lose the trees.
Thank you, Mr. Hobert. Are there any questions of the board? Thank you very much.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry, you do have one question. Mr. Burkhart.
Could you identify where your property sits in relation to the Alaska?
Yes, I'm on Checkmate, and my property runs right along the driveway that comes in on Checkmate. It's lot 17, block 16. So I kind of stick right into...
So you're the property that's probably more affected than anyone else in here in terms of traffic in and out of there?
From that, yes, we get a lot of up and down that driveway, and that's probably, if there was overflow parking, that they would be parking on the street in front of my house and I've never seen that. As a matter of fact, talking with Mr. Brewster and Mr. Sossaman, they have kind of a problem with people in the apartment houses, I think it is down across Checkmate there, that park in their parking lot and then go down to their apartments sometimes, visitors and stuff. So actually, sometimes they get encroached upon. So.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any other questions? If not, thank you, Mr. Hobert, for your time.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else from the public wishing to testify? Anyone at all? Seeing none, the public hearing is closed. Does staff have any further rebuttal?
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Dwiggins, do you have any rebuttal to offer?
I don't want to call it rebuttal, but I think it would be really in the best interest of everybody to not make us build some of these spaces that we would need to do recapture, particularly those along the back, the north line. There's about 9 spaces that are going to be parallel to the trees that are there, and I'm sure the neighbors would prefer that we not build those. So I guess, I don't know if it's appropriate at this time to amend the variance, but those 9 spaces we would prefer not to build. But I'll leave it at that.
Well, I guess that brings the question, what the variance before us. Mr. Barrett, are we able to do that, I guess? I don't believe that's what's been reviewed or
Mr. Chairman, the way the variance was advertised, it was for fewer parking spaces than required by code with no number set. But drainage, PM&E, traffic, all those folks looked at it for a certain number on a certain site plan. So I think it would be prudent, unfortunately, to say, no, I'm sorry, we can't do that.
There was nothing else, Mr. Dwiggins? That was all. He's indicated there is none. With that in mind, the matter rests with the board, and I would ask for a positive motion from the board. Ms. Croft, you've indicated. Ms. Croft.
Yes, in case number 2010-032, I move that we grant a request for, we grant a variance from AMC 21.45.080 to allow fewer than the required number of parking spaces, subject to conditions 1 through 3 on pages 8 and 9 of the staff packet.
Thank you, Ms. Croft. Have we have a second? Mr. Ron, you've indicated you have seconded that motion?
That's correct.
Thank you, Mr. Ron. Ms. Croft, you speak to your motion, please.
Yes, in this case, we just have to find that 2 standards have been met, and in the case of the first standard, that the variance number of parking spaces shall be granted on the basis of demonstrated need for parking. I believe that the applicant has provided, although not a standard parking count, at least an anecdotal parking count where the parking lot was never full. And I believe that the testimony of Mr. Hobart confirms that there has not been overflow parking in the adjacent neighborhoods. So on the basis of that evidence, I believe that standard 1 has been met, and I agree with staff on that standard. In terms of standard number 2, that spillover parking onto other properties will be avoided. I believe that the applicant has provided an adequate area for spillover parking for an additional 52 spaces if need is demonstrated after the construction of the tennis courts. And so I do believe that standard 2 is met. And just as an aside, I find that in an area where we're have residential butting up to an area like this, that I would prefer to see the trees stay there as a buffer until the time that a need is actually demonstrated for that. So I do plan on supporting the motion.
Thank you, Ms. Croft. Mr. Ron.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I intend to support Ms. Croft's motion as well for the reasons stated and those found by staff in our staff packet. Of additional note, as was discussed, the use of the structure appears not to warrant the additional spaces. And given Mr. Burkhart's recognition of Department Recommendation 3, limiting seating in that structure, I think that we do well to grant the variance as stated. I'd also like to echo Board Member Croft's comments about the trees and would like to see them stay to the extent possible as well.
Thank you, Mr. Ron. Mr. Burkhart.
I intend to vote for the variance request. I think that the new proposed layout is actually superior in a couple of respects. There's more parking adjacent to the main entry of the building. There's handicap spaces that you don't have to cross a drive aisle to get to the main entry. So I think they've made some significant improvements. And I'm happy that we're still on the 279 spaces. You know, given the testimony we had for periodic snow storage, having those 9 spaces that on the north side of the property, I think gives them just, a little bit more buffer and within the amount of parking spaces and the demonstrated need. So with all that, I intend to vote for the variance request.
Thank you, Mr. Burkhart. Are there any other comments or discussion from the board members? Seeing none, please vote. That motion passes 7-0. I must read for the record. Any party aggrieved by this decision has 30 days to appeal to Superior Court. The 30-day appeal period commences to run upon mailing of the written decision. That will bring us to our next case, H2, which is 2010-026. Mr. Burkhart and I will be recusing ourselves, and I believe, Mr. Ron, you and I need to to do some log in, log out on our screens.
And I guess one thing for Mr. Ron, hopefully to take care of is, we discussed earlier the short board situation, and we also ought to go over what the voting's like with conflicts of interest, how that affects the total necessary for.
And I believe that's something that Mr. Barrett can speak to with regard to that case.
Certainly, Mr. Chairman, for the sake of any of the board members who didn't read the flurry of emails and for the members of the audience, the board consists normally of 9 members. We have 1 vacancy, 1 absent, and 2 conflicts of interest. So 9 minus 4 brings us down to 5 board members, which is legally a short board. In a short board situation, all 5 votes are required to approve the variance. Because a unanimous vote is required, the applicant is offered a free postponement to the next meeting. And I believe this is the point at which we're going to ask the representative whether or not he formally did wish to proceed. Other than that, I'm finished.
Thank you, Mr. Cars, and Mr. Burkhart. I'm logged in now. Yes, I did. Yes, I did. Am I showing up? Okay. All right. I apologize for the technical difficulties there. We had to do some logging out, logging in of our system. So that brings us to case number 2 in our public hearings on the agenda, 2010-026, the petitioner True Gach Meadows 2 Condo Association. Is the petitioner or his or her representative here this evening? Please state and spell your name for the record.
Yes, Mr. Chair. My name is Tamás Deák. It's spelled D-E-A-K. I represent the Homeowners Association, and with me there is legal counsel and some homeowners. If you have questions later, you can ask those.
Thank you, Mr. Deák. I need to ask an initial question before we proceed with staff's presentation. Are you aware of Mr. Barrett's description of our board situation, that we're now in a short member board and you have the opportunity to postpone your case?
Yes, Mr. Barrett and I have been exchanging information about this, and it appears that postponement is not what we want to do at this time, so we'll move forward.
In the knowledge that granting the variance will require 5 votes out of our short board, it appears the petitioner has elected to move forward this evening.
Correct, yes.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Deák.
Thanks.
All right, Mr. Barrett, will staff please provide sufficiency of notice?
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. 110 public hearing notices were mailed for this. We did not receive any responses. The properties were advertised and posted.
Thank you. Well, please proceed with your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a type of parking variance, but it is a variance for the dimensional requirements of the parking area, not for the number of spaces. And in going through what the violation or what the problem is, I'm going to make reference to the as-built on page 2 and the applicant's preferred option on page 4. So you may see me flipping back and forth between those 2 pages on a fairly regular basis. What has happened is the buildings on the lot, and there are 4 buildings, each on its own property, each building consisting of 8 condos, pairs of buildings facing each other across a common drive area and the parking spaces for the units. The buildings have been placed a little too close together, and there is not enough room in the drive area for legal width driveways and parking spaces. So, never mind, I'll get into that as we go through. The as-built, you can see from the pairs of buildings facing each other, the gray areas between the buildings, the shaded areas between the buildings. Because these are two-way driveways, we would need 24 feet of width, and then we would need parking spaces at 90 degrees to the buildings, perpendicular, with dimensions of 9 feet wide by 20 feet long. There is also a requirement for multi-family units such as this to provide a 4-foot wide area, either for a sidewalk or for landscaping, between the parking area and the buildings. Because the buildings are a little too close together, all of those items cannot be accommodated. It's just not physically possible any longer to provide the 4-foot sidewalk or landscaped area, have the 24-foot driveway, and a 24-foot wide driveway, and have all of the required parking at 9 by 20 spaces. A cut is going to have to be made somewhere. Mr. Dayak has examined at least 3 different possible scenarios to try and accommodate the most parking with the least disruption, and he has selected as his preferred option, I assume the condo association as well, and the department concurs, which we'll get to in a moment, the preferred option, which is listed as Appendix I and is shown on page 4 of the department report. I'll let Mr. Dayak go into the history of how this all happened, but briefly, when the structures were built, the developer was granted a conditional certificate of occupancy and began selling the units. When individual owners then began applying for final certificates of occupancy and inspections were conducted, the various problems began to be noted. And that's why we're here today. Because this is a variance for dimensions to the parking area, there are, we use the 7 standard variance requirement questions for the case. So let me go right in to the findings beginning on page 9. Standard 1, that there exists an exceptional or extraordinary physical circumstance on the property, such as streams, wetlands, slope, etc. This standard is not substantially met. There is nothing physically unusual about the property. We've not been able to identify any slopes, streams, wetlands, or other physical deficiencies. The need for the variances apparently has arisen due to human error. The buildings were not placed far enough apart to allow for parking, sidewalks, and the 2-way drive aisles. Standard number 2, because of the physical circumstances, strict application would create an exceptional or undue hardship. This standard is partially met. Although there is no physical deficiency in the property that we can identify related to the need for the variance, the applicant has examined several different solutions attempting to use current code standards to see what he could do to minimize the problem. Nothing works perfectly, and requiring or denying this standard would cause the dislocation of at least 16 owners and possibly all 32 owners on the property. Therefore, the department considers this to be an exceptional and undue hardship and believes the standard is at least partially met. Standard 3, that the hardship is not self-imposed. Normally on this standard, we must acknowledge that if an owner has bought into a problem, then he has bought into the problem and he is in some fashion partially responsible, and the standard is, or the hardship is, partially self-imposed. In this case, we believe the standard is at least partially met. Although there are no physical conditions affecting the property, the builder-developer did put the units up. He did get conditional certificates of occupancy, and then he sold units to individual owners. Those individual owners did not create the problem. They were unaware that anything was wrong. Conditional certificates had been issued. The builder-developer is now gone. I'm not sure what the status of the company is. Mr. Dayak can mention that if it's pertinent. Standard number 4, that the variance, if granted, does not adversely affect use of adjacent property. That standard is substantially met. We've not identified any structure separation violations. Drainage and runoff are not a problem. The setback is not visually obvious. There have been no objections from the neighborhood, And most importantly, the properties have been in use for several years without any apparent ill effect. All 32 of the owners are aware of what's going on here, and it apparently has not been a problem for the development. Standard 5, that the variance, if granted, is in keeping with the intent of the code. The standard is substantially met. The requested variance is dimensional. There are minor changes. The drive aisles will still be 24 feet wide. There will not be the 4-foot separation between buildings and parking area. But in terms of the number of parking spaces that will not be legal size of 9 by 20, I believe that's only 6, so it's a relatively small impact. And again, I should add that Mr. Dayak has examined at least 3 different scenarios, and the preferred scenario is the one that appears to cause the least impact to the owners of the units and to the surrounding neighborhood. Standard 6, the variance, if granted, does not adversely affect health, safety, and welfare. Again, substantially met, no identified issues. The fire department has no objection to the solution as shown on page 4 and in Appendix I. The traffic department initially supported the option shown in Appendix E, as in echo, but they do not object to Appendix I as it is conditioned. Standard 7, the variance, if granted, is the minimum that will make possible a reasonable use. That standard is substantially met. Once again, the applicant has analyzed several options for the parking spaces and the drive aisles. We believe he has come to the best balance. All the options have their pros and cons, but the option shown in Appendix I is the most reasonable, causes the least disruption to both the subject and surrounding properties. However, since Standard 1 is not met, the department must recommend denial. However, there are 3 conditions on page 12 should the board find for approval. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett. Does the board have any questions of staff?
Mr. Chairman, who was the developer?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Fink, the name, I believe, was Discovery Homes, but I better check with Mr. Dayak. I think was it Bobby Burnett?
Yes, the legal name, Mr. Chair, legal name is Discovery Homes, Mr. Burnett and Mr. Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Dayak. Ms. Croft.
I have several questions. I believe in terms of the number of spaces affected, you said 6. I think it might be 6 per unit, per building. At least that's what it looks like to me. So that would be then a total of 24 spots that are affected. And I just wanted to confirm that, and I see Mr. Dayak's head's nodding. In looking, well, it appears that there are also garages in these units. The striping doesn't seem to line up very well with those garages. Do we think there'll be any issue with them actually getting into their garages?
Mr. Chairman.
Or I can hold that question if you'd prefer.
No, it's all right, Ms. Croft. I was just trying to remember what I was thinking. We went over this several times with traffic, and that one of the proposals, if I can find the page very quickly, did show some angled parking. And if you can see on the color aerial photograph you've got, you'll actually see that the parking is angled right now. No one parks that way. They all park at 90 degrees. So in order to address the issue, traffic did specifically ask for conditions number 2 and 3 in order to address that concern. And we're satisfied that since these are owner-occupied units, the folks who live there know how it's working, and they seem to be making it function well.
Okay, thank you. And the other question, the 4-foot wide sidewalk between, or landscaping between the building and the the parking, I mean, when you look at some of the photos, like on page 16 and 18, I believe it is, it does appear as if they're already parking in a manner that gives them a 4-foot buffer, really. None of them are parking their cars right up against the building. So it seems as if they're effectively having a narrower than 24-foot drive aisle currently. Do you agree with that? And then there doesn't seem to be any problem with that?
I do tend to agree with that. These are owner-occupied units. They're not pulling up flush to the building because they realize they've got to walk in front of their own vehicle for the shortest way to get into the unit. And I agree that it does not seem to be a problem. On the 2 site visits I was there, I did not attempt to measure the drive aisle width, but it seemed more than adequate, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Vig.
Mr. Barrett, could you explain the conditions under which the conditional CO would be issued? In other words, would there have been some review done by the building department to ascertain whether the dimensions of the parking area were sufficient to meet the code requirements?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vig, it's a case-by-case basis, so I really can't give you specifics, cannot give you specifics, but it would have been, the CCOs would have been based simply on the preliminary drawings that were submitted at the time, showing that things were up to code.
And I assume it would be customary for people purchasing these units to rely on that as some indication that formal CO or final CO would be a procedural thing to go through. Is that correct?
I would think they would have placed great reliance on it, yes.
Thank you.
Any other board questions of staff? Seeing none, thank you, Mr. Barrett. Will the petitioner's representative please come forward? And I'm going to ask you to state your name again, reminding you that before you proceed with your presentation, you do have 10 minutes, not to exceed 10 minutes. And the board requests that you speak to the 7 standards before us, remembering that the preponderance or burden of proof of showing that preponderance is on the petitioner in showing that those 7 standards have been met. So please state your name and proceed.
Good evening, Mr. Chair and members of the board. Al, thank you for getting this far. My name is Tamás Deák. Last name is spelled D-E-A-K. I'm a principal at KPB Architects representing Chugach Meadows Homeowners Association. I have the legal counsel with me, Rob Schmidt, and some homeowners association members and homeowners as well in the audience. So if you have specific questions about use, they will be able to discuss those. I would like to reserve 2 minutes of my time for rebuttal. And with that, just a very brief history on how we got here. It's something I think probably needs to be examined in the long term for municipal development reviews and how projects happen. Where we are is, more importantly, a situation where a development cannot stand or stay. This development has been in this situation for 5 years, and the conditional approvals, occupancies have been expiring, and the homeowners are looking to remedy the situation. Since the homeowner association is the legal entity now to deal with any kind of land use issues on this condo, basically they are now the responsible party to come forward and find a remedy. Based on the correspondence and reviewing lots of documents, original drawings, and talking with the municipal departments, I did several analyses for determining what would be the best way to go forward, and the proposed layout basically in a parking variance, Appendix I, is where we felt that a move could be made to remedy the situation. Let's then maybe jump into the conditions standards right away so we can go through them. First of all, I want to thank traffic, fire, and especially Barrett at Planning to work with me on this, for working with me on this. It's been a very complicated technical type of review, and it appears that it was a thorough review, and I see a lot of issues here which I concur with in terms of staff reviews and statements, and also in the packet, generally a positive outcome. Findings on number one is the one where the substantial the standard is not substantially met based on the analysis of staff. This is what I would like to address most. And basically, this is the condition where there has to be an exceptional, extraordinary physical circumstance to grant this variance. In our view, the exceptional and extraordinary physical circumstance has to do not just the actual project, how it has been constructed, but also who the entity is responsible to address the issues. And since the entity which now addresses the issues have not been present to physically occupy this property, they have come after the physical conditions of the land were altered by placing buildings on them. With good faith, they purchased them, and then in the process, they learned that there are deficiencies. I think, and this is where we don't necessarily see eye to eye with staff, that this is an extraordinary and exceptional condition, regardless of the land being generally assumed to be affected by wetlands or other natural features. And the crux of the issue is exactly that. The homeowners came into a situation which now is up to them to resolve, and the physical conditions were already in existence when they were coming into this situation. And that, I think, is a significant issue here at this case. With that, there are a couple of standards here which have been addressed as partially met. I would concur with the analysis of Mr. Barrett. The second one is the standard where a strict application of the code would create an exceptional undue hardship. The strict application of the code would do that because the resolution for finding any remedy here would create such a situation. As Mr. Barrett stated, because of the physical conditions of this project, in order for the buildings to be separated to the right distances, they would have to be unoccupied, basically moved, demolished, or whatever way rebuilt, which basically negates the whole reason why this process is even going forward. And that I consider a serious hardship, which I think you as a board should consider, and we would appreciate if you would do so. Number three is the hardship is not self-imposed. I believe it is not. The reason for that is, again, the development process, how we do develop buildings and how we occupy them. There is an intermediate step where a lot of trust and a lot of, I guess, a review of actual documents for the future project have played a significant roles. In this project, there was no indication anywhere where a homeowner could determine that what they are buying is deficient. Every drawing, every review, and every permit related discussion has not brought that up before the purchase took place. After the purchase took place, the final CO is where the process started to go to the direction where the homeowner just simply couldn't find a resolution to those issues which we are facing today. Number 4, 5, 6, and 7 are conditions which staff concurs to be substantially met. And unless you have questions about those, I wouldn't go into those in any detail. And with that, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dayak. Any questions from the board of the petitioner.
Mr. Big. Mr. Dayak, thank you for your presentation. I believe that someone else asked the question about the exact number of the parking spaces that are this variance is requested for. Is it? Can you
Yes.
describe on your Appendix I drawing, page 4 in our packet, which spaces those are for me, please?
Yes, basically, we felt that the list of the variances for this project for finding any resolution is not variance to a number of parking spaces, but rather dimensional variances. And that variance affects 6 spaces for each building. If you look at the drawing, you can see that the buildings are basically crawl space foundation type buildings, and in order for legal access into these buildings, stoops have been constructed. And those stoops are the impediment for the parking spaces to be full legal dimension. And those parking spaces which are in front of the entries where the entry stoops are the ones which are impacted by the dimensional variance for the parking spaces only. The dimensional variance for the separation between parking lots and buildings is applicable to every building along every side of parking space or parking lots, but it is basically a dimensional variance from we're not allowing 4 feet because the room is just simply not there, but between, I believe it was 1.5 foot to 2 feet or so. So there is a deficiency in the dimension, but there is some dimension which allows some separation. The plot plan shows the full, basically the current conditions for as to what sort of spacing there are between the buildings, and simply put, between 2 buildings, in order to meet the 90-degree diagonal or 90-degree perpendicular standard, you would have to have a 24-foot drive aisle, a 20-foot parking space, and a 4-foot separation distance on each side. So that adds up to be 68 if I do the math right, and rather 72 if I do the math right. And the distance is here in that 68, 69 feet range, and that's where the deficiency is.
Okay, thank you. And so on that drawing, for example, the northerlymost building where you have parking stall number 17 in front of it, there's a dimension of 3 feet. Is that intended to show the protrusion of the stoop then?
Correct, yes.
And not a walking aisle or anything like that?
No, it doesn't show the walking aisle, but it does, by physically being there, creates the walking aisle. One note I would make, and I believe I did that in the packet as well, is that these buildings are townhouse-style buildings. That means that access to them comes from the front, so there is really no physical need for passage in front of the buildings. Every building basically gets a parking space in front of it or 2, and the driver gets out of the car and goes towards the building, so there is no real physical need for passage in front of the building. So that's why we chose the dimensional variance as a lesser one, because it doesn't hinder the physical occupancy of this property.
Okay, thank you.
Board Member Croft.
Yes, hi. Two questions for you. I just want to confirm what Mr. Baird had said, based on the drawings that we see, like on page 6, the aerial, that the way that the parking is currently being used is what you are proposing.
Correct.
Really in this, and that there has not been any problem in that existing configuration for, first, has there been a problem, and how long has it operated that way?
The question to the first one is no, there has not been a problem. This is basically an interesting scenario on use, because this building has been tried, a couple of striping or not the building, but the parking lot has been in the process of trying to meet the conditions for a conditional or a certificate of occupancy. It has been striped numerous times, I think 2 or 3 times, with diagonal type parking striping, and some of it is visible, but it's supposed to have been removed. But regardless of it being visible or not, the owners occupy this parcel by this parking lot by driving in and diagonal or perpendicular parking in front of the buildings, just like the proposed layout suggests. So it is based on current use. The other question in terms of how long it's been used, the buildings were completed in 2005, and from that time, as they were sold off, the owners moving in, that makes it at least 4 years.
Thank you. And the other question I had is sort of a follow-up to Mr. Viggs earlier about the CCO. Presumably that was a follow-up then to a building permit that was issued. Did that permit show the parking in this configuration, or did it show it in a, did the parking show a compliant parking?
Yes, if you look at, I'm going to refer to my documents as submitted, and there is a drawing called Appendix A, which was the original plot plan dated 2004, October 7. That is the drawing which was the driver for the layout of this project, and that shows perpendicular parking along the building's edge, and it has been reviewed and approved, as you can see it on the stamp, by the building department for construction.
So again, the owners, the current owners, could have looked at this and seen that it had been approved and it appeared to be compliant.
I believe not they just could have, but that they have done that, yes.
Okay, thank you very much.
Any other questions from the board for the petitioner? Mr. Barrett, does staff have any questions of the petitioner?
No, thank you.
And any rebuttal, Mr. Barrett?
No, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dayak. Before we open the public hearing, Mr. Barrett, I'll ask for a little bit of guidance here. It appears that we have some owners, part of the condo association, in the audience. In the past, how has the board dealt with the situation in terms of public testimony from owners within an association?
Mr. Chairman, they're represented by Mr. Dayak, so if he has any rebuttal time left, you could turn it over to them.
Okay.
That's all.
Sure. So, with that said, then we'd like to open the hearing for public testimony. Again, as Mr. Barrett stated, the board would prefer that if you're an owner in the homeowners association that you speak once we get to the rebuttal period. The petitioner has reserved some time for that. So if there's anyone in the audience who's not a member of the homeowners association and would like to come forward and testify, please do so. Seeing no one, we'll close the public hearing.
If I may. Board members, my name is Robert Schmidt. I'm an attorney in the law firm Grow Acres LLC, and I am legal counsel for the association, although I am not representing the association before this board. In regards to Mr. Barrett's comment that the owners are not members of the public, this parking area is a common element that is owned by the association, which is a nonprofit corporation. They are owners of individual units, and I would ask the board to consider that in their capacity as owning their individual units, they are in fact members of the public who would be impacted by your decision, so you should allow them to comment as members of the public and not just as in their capacity as being members of the homeowners association. And I would also note that there's maybe 5 or 6 of them here, and if you've only got 2 minutes left, let me see what you're saying. They have 30 seconds to speak each.
Well, I suspect board members may have some questions for owners of the units. So let's hear from someone from the public, given what was just stated. Is that reasonable? Looking for a nod from the board. Mr. Barrett?
Mr. Chairman, I don't know, that's a fine point of law. Yes, the parking is common and available, and they don't even have to have it assigned if they don't wish to, but the variance is not for the units, it's for the parking area, and the official representation is Mr. Dayak. Should the individual owners be allowed to speak? I don't think we're running late, so the department has no objection.
Mr. Fink, do you have a comment?
Well, I just would be uncomfortable not allowing them to speak. I mean, this is a public hearing, and whether we want to split those fine points or not, they're here, and I think they should be allowed to address the board.
Okay. Given the reasons as stated, the public testimony is either reopened or still open, so ask someone to come forward. Please state your name and spell it for the record, and I believe you're given 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Jeremy Hayes, Jeremyhayes, and I am a member of Chugach Meadows 2 Condo Association. First, I'd like to thank the board for taking the time to hear our variance request this evening, and also for the opportunity to testify. I am the president of Chugach Meadows 2 Condo Association, and I can certainly attest that there has been a great deal of emotional distress on behalf of the homeowners over the past 5 years as we have tried to secure our final COs. Having said that, I will not bore you with an emotional appeal. I certainly understand that that's not something that's going to be considered by the board when you render an ultimate decision. But what I can tell you, having spoken to each and every one of the homeowners, is that I can say with the utmost confidence that I speak for everyone when I say that I wholeheartedly support this variance. The other thing I would like to say as well is that the parking configuration, the way it is now, is the way it's always been, and I've never witnessed a homeowner or anyone otherwise that's had a problem with it. I think it works the way it is. I've witnessed fire trucks, ambulances, emergency personnel, and anyone else that's ever had to enter and exit or traverse that area has been able to do so without any trouble. And so basically, I would just like to say that I feel I speak on behalf of everyone. I certainly support the variance, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Hayes. Does the board have any questions, public?
Mr. Chairman, I have a quick question. Mr. Hayes, thank you for your testimony. I'm looking at one of the appendixes, Appendix F. I don't know if you have the packet, but it shows an access lane on the east side of the properties. Does that exist now, or no? You can't actually. There is no access lane on the east part of the property, is there?
He's asking about the proposed.
That does not exist at the moment. That was in the process of trying to figure out different ways to appropriately address the parking issue. That was one that at one time had been drawn up as a potential way to fix that problem, and it was not deemed the most appropriate avenue to take as far as meeting those requirements. So no, that does not exist at the time.
Thank you.
Any other board questions of Mr. Hayes? All right, thank you for testimony. Is there anyone else from the public wishing to testify? Please state and spell your name for the record, and you have 3 minutes.
My name is Thomas Beckman. It's spelled Beckman, and I am a homeowner, and I'm also on the board of Chugach Meadows 2 Condo Association. Just wanted to state that I do believe this is a good idea, and we have looked at a number of alternatives, and this one works for everybody. We've actually been doing this, as indicated, for 5 years, and there were questions asked about whether it's functional, whether there were problems. And with all parking situations being tight like this one is, there are a few problems. You know, when the snow's down on the ground, it covers the marks. You can't see the lanes, but people there work together and they work it out and make it work. Regarding the conditional certificates of occupancy, yeah, when we bought these places, we indeed believed that those would come to fruition with
official certificates, and have been surprised pretty significantly with this builder, with not just this issue, but with other issues that we've had to contend with. And we definitely ask for your leniency and your approval of this variance so that we can get on with those COs, so that we can stop hindering people's ability to obtain financing to purchase and sell these units. And that's all the questions, or that's all that I have to say at this point. Any questions?
Thank you, Mr. Beckman. Any questions from the board? Mr. Vig.
Thank you, Mr. Beckman. If the board would approve this request, there's 3 conditions that the department has recommended attaching to the approval, one of which is requiring some parking signs to restrict the 18.5-foot parking stalls to small cars only, and then one resolving with traffic engineer to come up with some additional signage or homeowner document language to prevent garage doors from being blocked by other owners. Are those the kinds of conditions that, I know you can't speak for your other board members, but are those things you think can work?
Yeah, I think so. Most folks, if you have the entryway in front of your house blocking part of your driveway, cars generally people aren't driving 1-ton trucks in there, and you're not having parking issues. Most folks have vehicles that will fit those spaces, and it's been working since 2005. Posting signs, I think it's, if it meets the variance, if that's what we need to do, we'll do it. But I think in all respects, most people are smart enough to figure out, well, if their car's it's going to stick out and protrude too far, they'd park in the stall next to it so that they don't have that issue. So I think it's workable.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions of Mr. Beckman? Thank you for your testimony.
You're welcome.
Is there anyone else from the public wishing to come forward and testify? Please state and spell your name for the record. You have 3 minutes.
My name is William Aiken, William. Last name Aiken, Akin. I'd just basically like to concur and testify that I have been living there since 2005, and there really has been no issue with parking. Everybody does use common sense, and if we could avoid any kind of signage, like the previous speaker said, that would be preferred. But if that's what needs to be done, then of course we'd just like to get our CO in and just be done with this whole process finally.
Thank you, Mr. Aiken. Any questions from the board? All right. Thank you for testimony.
Thank you.
Someone else from the public wishing to testify? Please state and spell your name for the record, and you have 3 minutes.
My name is Matthew Clark, C-L-A-R-K. I've bought my home in 2007. Been living there for 3 years. I have personally called the fire department 3 times and had the ambulance show up to my own residence. There's never been an issue. People have still come and gone while those emergency vehicles were there. We have faced a lot of issues with this builder. It's been stated before, and we would just like to move on and get our COs.
Thank you, Mr. Clark. Any questions from the board? Seeing none, thank you for your testimony. Anyone else from the public wishing to testify? Okay. Seeing none, close the public testimony. Mr. Barrett, any rebuttal from staff?
Just a general statement, Mr. Chairman. If the board does approve the variance with the 3 conditions, I would just want to put everyone's in the audience, put their mind at ease that the conditions, satisfying the conditions, will not delay the CO process. We'll start on that tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett. And any rebuttal from the petitioner?
Mr. Chair, thank you. I take this opportunity to not use it as a rebuttal, but just to emphasize the one item which I generally don't deal with, which is the process which is hindered by not having these COs. And that process has to do with how the homeowners can get financing, how they can maybe change their life, move in somewhere else and sell the units. That is really the human aspect of this very technical review, and I just want to emphasize that here at the end. And thank you again for your review and for your consideration.
Thank you, Mr. Dayak. With that, I believe the matter rests with the board. May I have a positive motion, please? Mr. Vig, it looks like you've made a motion.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, in the case 2010-026, I move that we grant a variance from AMC 21.45.080 X9A, which requires a 24-foot wide travel aisle and parking spaces with dimensions of 9 feet by 20 feet, and 21.45.080 X10B, which requires 4 feet of separation between a building and parking area on the same lot to allow for sidewalks, landscaping, or both to reduce the dimensions as shown on Appendix I of the application, and subject to the requirements noted on page 12 of the packet.
Thank you, Mr. Vigan. Is that requirements 1 and 2? Or
3?
1, 2, and 3, yes.
Yes.
Good, thank you. And Ms. Croft, it looks like you seconded. Is that correct? Okay. Mr. Vig, please speak to your motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With regard to standard number 1, I do believe that there is an exceptional or extraordinary physical circumstance created by the issuance of the conditional CO, which I believe creates or allows people in the public considering buying units like this to rely on those that the plans were conformed with and, in effect, create a physical circumstance of the land that exists in real terms. So, in my mind, I think that that's at least partially, if not substantially, met. It is an extraordinary situation that the intention was to construct something that met the dimensional requirements, and that at the end of the day it didn't meet those requirements, but that it wasn't discovered until after the fact. So I believe that those are extenuating and extraordinary physical circumstances of the property, and so I believe that that standard is met. Standard number 2, the physical circumstances, if this strict application of this code would be applied, I think that would create an undue hardship upon the property owners. Obviously, removing and reconstructing housing units 3 or 4 feet away is a tremendous hardship on the property owners to consider. So I think that that's a standard that's met. Standard 3, the hardship is not self-imposed. Oftentimes we are faced with cases that people buy or construct things on their own. This was a case where people relied upon information that I think people would expect to be accurate and approved plot plans, which indicate that the building department has reviewed and approved them. And so I think that that is not a self-imposed hardship. I believe that standard is met. Standard number 4 will not, the variance if granted will not adversely affect the use of adjacent property. I think that that's substantially met. It clearly does not impinge on any adjacent properties. Fire department doesn't seem to object between the or with the issuance of the variance request. Standard number 5 will not change the character of the zoning district in which the property is located. I believe that that standard is substantially met as well. It's a dimensional variance, not a use variance. Standard number 6, the variance if granted does not adversely affect the health, safety, and welfare. Based on the department's comments, I believe that this is the best solution that can be found in this case, and I believe that it will not affect the health, safety, and welfare of people of the municipality. And Standard 7, the variance granted is the minimum variance that will make possible a reasonable use of the land. I think the fact that it's been used in this fashion for 4 or 5 years states the fact that it's makes a reasonable use of the land, and I think the alternatives that were looked at demonstrate that this is the minimum variance that will allow that to remain. And so, for those reasons, I intend to vote in support of the motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vig. Ms. Croft, would you care to speak to the motion?
Yes, I also intend to support the motion. I think that Standard 1 has been difficult to grapple with because the underlying land doesn't present any peculiar circumstances. But I do think that because of the way that the property was developed, permit issued, and CCOs issued, that I am persuaded by the argument that those buildings did become part of the physical landscape at that time when these property owners purchased their properties. And so in that sense, those buildings became part of an exceptional physical circumstance where it became impossible to meet the code in all of the parking recommendations or parking requirements by code. And I agree with Mr. Vig on his analysis of the other standards. Just to reiterate on Standard 7 about this being the minimum variance, I do believe that looking at the other alternatives was important, and Mr. Dayak did mention that this was dimensional instead of a parking count variance. I think that actually will function better in the long run. I think if you started trying to take away parking spots there, we would start having some much more problems than you would just by having them be slightly shorter. And that the fact that they have been able to operate for this long without any problems and then emergency vehicles can get in there reassures me that this is an acceptable alternative. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Croft. Any other discussion on the motion? Mr. Fink.
Mr. Chairman, I am having some difficulty with this variance, and I don't fault the Homeowners Association. I think in this case the city is culpable in approving the building permits. I think the developer is culpable, and I don't want to get in the way of the homeowners being able to get certificates of occupancy. I think they relied on the city's approval, so it puts me in a tough position. But I'm having really significant difficulty with Standard Number 1, and if any other commissioners have anything to add, I'd appreciate hearing that. I'm also not sure this is the minimum variance. I'm looking at Appendix F, for instance. That seems a more reasonable sort of variance. I guess I'm somewhat disturbed that, the 24-foot wide travel aisles trumping 4 feet separation between a building, so you've got no space for, kids to walk or grass or plants or places to put bikes. And that bothers me. I think that the zoning laws were meant to prevent this sort of construction and this sort of situation. So I am having some difficulty. I'm not sure where I'm at on this and would be interested in hearing from other commissioners.
Thank you, Mr. Fink. Mr. Barrett.
Mr. Chairman, I cannot help Mr. Fink with Standard Number 1, but in regards to Appendix F, the reason we and traffic and fire do not like it is because the parking spaces in front of the units are at such an angle, it is almost guaranteed that you will be blocking neighbors' garage doors. The driveway aisle on the left-hand side of the page on the west side of the property is in a drainage and utility easement, and it is unlikely that could get permitted. and the drive width of the aisles is only 20 feet wide, approximately halfway down. I'm not certain fire would accept that. They generally like a 20-foot wide driveway as far as they can get it, and it must be to within 150 feet of all points of the property. So briefly, that is why the departments do not care for F. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett. Mr. Vig.
Maybe Mr. Barrett mentioned it. I didn't hear, but I think it's also worth noting that Appendix F, the layout, there provides 19 parking spaces per building unit, whereas Appendix I, the preferred by the applicant, provides 21. I believe it's more in conformance with the required parking. Is that also true? And so with regard to the question about whether it's the minimum variance or not, it may shift from a dimensional variance to a variance in the number of required parking spaces.
Thank you, Mr. Vig. For the record, I do intend to support the motion. Mr. Fink, I respect the difficulty you're having with Standard 1. In regards to that standard, as both board members Croft and Vig tied the issuance of the CCOs to an alteration of the physical circumstances of the land, and I think that does carry enough weight for me to find that Standard 1 is at least partially met, if not met. Regarding your concerns and statement of the purpose of the code to allow separation between the building, aside from fire separation, something that allows beautification of the property. As Board Member Croft pointed out, vehicles are currently parking in a way that is not directly abutting the building, but allowing some allowance for travel, safe travel between the buildings and the vehicles. For those reasons and the fact that we're dealing with a unique and, as staff pointed out, very exceptional and undue hardship, can find that Standard 1 is at least partially met. Any other discussion?
Mr. Chairman, I am persuaded to support this. A factor that weighs heavily with me, though it's not one of the standards, it's the detrimental reliance of the residents. And to me that plays in because they're not at fault here. I think the standards are met maybe, by a thread, and I'll support it, but this is a tough vote for me.
Thank you, Mr. Fink. Ms. Croft.
I just wanted to follow up a little bit on the discussion about the space in front of the units. The planning of the entire complex was sort of designed, I think, to allow that open space, the place for bikes and for beautification, for landscaping, is designed to be behind the units. And so you can see that there are those larger spaces behind. On some of the pictures, they do show that. And I think the 4 feet, if it were allowed there, I mean, if they were able to have it, it would be for a sidewalk, not for plantings. So, and since they, as Mr. Ron, Mr. Chairman said, they are using it that way as a sidewalk currently.
Thank you, Ms. Croft. Any other comments? Seeing none, let's vote. With that, the motion passes. The variance is granted with a vote of 5 yeas and 2 recusals. I must dutifully read that any party aggrieved by this decision has 30 days to appeal to Superior Court. The 30-day appeal period commences to run upon mailing of the written decision. Right. With that, my tenure as chair is completed. Would the board like a brief 5-minute recess? Okay. Let's take 5 minutes. Thanks.
Could you go ahead and
log out? Yes.
And log out over yours and log
Okay.
back in?
All righty.
That brings us, we are back in session. Mr. Ron, thank you for handling that case so adequately. That brings us to public hearing case number 3, case 2010-046. The petitioner is Perlene Hernandez. Is the applicant here this evening? They've indicated by wave of the hand they are. Mr. Barrett, could you provide us with the sufficiency of notice, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The property was advertised and posted. 46 public hearing notices were mailed. We did not receive any returns. However, the applicant did submit several letters of support.
Thank you. Would you proceed with your presentation?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a request for a home to encroach the 20-foot front yard setback by approximately 2.7 feet. The as-built is on page 2 of the property. You can see the unit. You can see the encroachment labeled 17.3. Please note the location of the septic system on the north side of the dwelling unit. That's pertinent to standard number 1. The unit is a modular/mobile type building, and building permit files for that type of dwelling units are handled a little bit differently, and we've not been able to locate them. We've not been able to find any building permit files for the property. We have various computer references from 2001, 2007, and 2008 for mobile home setup and mobile home relocation with on the lot. And there are some helpful notes in there, but we do not actually have the permit files, so there are some things we cannot make definitive statements about. I can tell you that when the first application came in, the plan indicated the unit could meet the 20-foot front yard setback. However, at the time, the septic had not been fully located, and I cannot tell you how the unit came to be located only 3 feet into the setback. I cannot tell you how that came to be, and I cannot tell you what the files would reflect because there are no notes indicating any type of inspection or that it was ever in fact pointed out to the applicant. The property is relatively level, but it's located on the side of a hill and on a curve in the road, and these constraints do affect the lot. However, they do appear to affect most all the properties along the street. The septic system, as I say, is in the rear of the property, and there is a septic system separation distance that caused the unit to be placed a little further forward on the lot, and we suspect that's why the encroachment occurred. The unit is a mobile modular home, so by definition it is a little bit more movable than something that's site-built and attached to a foundation. However, it would create a hardship to move it. All the utilities are connected, the unit's occupied, and the area to which the unit would be moved to meet the setback would be some distance to the east into the area labeled gravel driveway, and that's the area where the applicant is proposing to build a new garage. So that would cause a conflict and further hardship, and the department is satisfied that the building is probably in the best location for it. Regarding the standards, standard number 1, that there exist exceptional or extraordinary physical circumstances. We believe the standard is substantially met. The variance can be reasonably related to slope, lot shape, and the location of the septic system. Although these constraints are not unique to the property, this lot is the smallest in terms of square feet. I believe it's about 500 square feet smaller than the next largest lot. It is the smallest on the street, and the department does consider these circumstances then to be exceptional. Additionally, the lot was platted before zoning regulations were adopted. It is a legal-sized lot, but that's just by happenstance because it was platted before the zoning rules were adopted. Standard number 2, because of the physical circumstances, strict application would create an undue or exceptional hardship. The standard substantially met. Moving the unit would be an undue hardship. The owners would need to vacate the property for a period of time. All utilities would have to be disconnected, relocated, and then reconnected. And we don't know for a fact that that could be done because there could be well and septic issues were that to happen. Further, we do not have as-built surveys for nearby properties, but it appears setback encroachment along the street may be fairly common. When you stand on the street and look down the row of homes, they all seem to be at or slightly less than the 20-foot front yard setback. There are a couple of photos on pages 9 and 10 that I took, and perhaps on page 8 as well, that I hope might give you a little bit of a feel for how close most of the units are to the home along the street. Regarding standard 3, that the hardship is not self-imposed, we believe the standard is substantially met. There are some physical conditions relating to the property and the need for the variance. And further, the variance does not appear to have been the result of actions of the applicant. He submitted a plot plan. It was approved. He did apply for 3 permits at various times. Is every indication he was attempting to comply with the code, and we have been unable to locate the actual permit files, so we must assume the applicant's paperwork was approved in 2007, 2001, 2007, and 2008, and we cannot tell you how with any real definition, how the violation came to be. Regarding standard 4, the variance, if granted, does not adversely affect adjacent properties. This is substantially met. No structural separation issues, drainage and runoff are not affected. The encroachment does not appear to be out of line with other structures along 80th Avenue, and there have been no objections from the neighborhood. Standard 5, substantially met. This is a dimensional request. The reduction in setback does not change the character of the zoning district as mentioned in Standard 4. In fact, it would be difficult to note that this building is placed any differently than others along 80th. Standard 6, the variance, if granted, does not adversely affect health, safety, and welfare. No identified health or safety issues came from the various reviews. And 7, the standard granted is the minimum variance, at least partially met. Based on the size of the lot, it does appear the home could have been legally located to meet all setbacks. However, we're unable to explain how the violation occurred, although we believe it's related to location of the septic system, and the encroachment is relatively small and not out of character with the neighborhood. Therefore, the department believes the standard is at least partially met. Because all the standards are fully or partially met, the department is recommending approval, and we have 3 conditions on page 7, should the board concur. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett. Are there any questions of staff by the board? Mr. Burkhart.
I'm looking at the site plan on page 36 of the packet. It appears that the edge of the road, although with the variance we're looking at the distance from the building to the property line, but in this particular case that there's really almost twice as much distance in terms of the distance from the road to the building. So You mentioned that this encroachment might not be very noticeable, and it seems like that's in favor, I guess, of that perception. Is that correct?
Yes, Mr. Burkhart, because the road is not fully constructed, it adds to the perception that there's adequate distance.
And I guess my second question is, or comment is that on page 38, the aerial photo, it looks like Evanson Court is developed back from Lucy Street, and that stops or dead ends, and it looks like from the trees there that it's not developed further. Where on page 39, it looks like it connects to Ingram Street, but it looks like that part of the road hasn't been constructed. Is that true?
That's correct. It's a cul-de-sac.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Vig.
Thank you. Mr. Barrett, is this above what would be considered for an administrative variance, or are there other conditions that disallow an administrative in this case?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vig, I don't recall the numbers. This is R5, a front yard setback. R5, front yard setback is only 9/10 of a foot. I guess that's about 11.8 inches or something. So he's a little bit over it.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Barrett.
Are there any other questions of staff? Seeing none, could the applicant come forward, please? And could you state and spell your name for the record, please?
My name is Terry Denuptis. My last name is spelled D-E-N-U-P-T-I-I-S. I am an occupier. I represent Ms. Hernandez, and I'm also an occupier of the property.
Thank you, Mr. Denuptis. And she is here this evening to indicate
yes, she's present right here.
To show that she supports having you represent her in this case. Okay, thank you.
Yes.
You have 10 minutes for your presentation. Could you proceed?
I'm going to go over the standards that we responded to, and already Mr. Barrett has already did the planning staff findings, so I'm going to bypass that. I'm not aware of the procedures, what actually happens here. This is new to me. So basically the standard one was that it was an oddly shaped lot, and the existing utility being placed there, the septic system, the curvature of the lot, the septic system was already there prior to us purchasing the lot, or Perlene purchasing the lot, that is. And the curvature of the lot was the major factor limiting the homeowner to place the mobile home structure and any other satisfactory placement to stay within the other code separation requirements pertaining to this lot, R5 lot. I was the one involved with the whole process of this, and upon moving the mobile home back, which I think that there was pictures also sent as an addendum to the packet of the size of the building going up as a 27 by 57 structure, and moving up around the curvature of that road to place it in there, my concern was to make sure that I didn't go past the minimum distance septic separation. That was my major concern at the time. And as Mr. Barrett said, that the mobile home setup permit that we had, it was not observed. I was not aware of the R5 yard setback, that the encroachment would be a problem. My major concern was to get it back there by as close to the septic as I could, to get as far off the road as I could. The building could not be downsized to meet the requirements necessary to stay within the zone frontage without compromising the structural integrity of the building, since it is designed and built on a steel frame, which is 27 by 57 at the mobile home factory of origin. Standard 2, because of the utility restrainment of the property and the difficult placement of the mobile home to get it into its current position to begin with, it was a one-shot deal getting it in there, which was pretty wheels actually on the trailer, because the trailer that carried the mobile home's weight was about 30 tons, so it was a one-shot deal. The tires were starting to recess into the ground as we moved it back in there. So to get it into its current position to begin with, and the future construction of a necessary garage for 2 cars, which is what's proposed in the future, probably around 2011. Many other homeowners in the area enjoy, which I did a survey on the other R5 homes in the area, and in that area, in the Hidden Hills area, out of 55 lots, and there's probably a few vacant ones there, right around 55 to 60% had 2-car garages, 1 to 2-car garages. So it's not an exceptional thing that we're having a proposed garage there. Moving the building in any other placement would have not made it possible to keep the 10-foot separation requirements from the garage from the home, because the home is not on a solid foundation. The community does not require a mobile home setup permit to have a solid foundation, so we are blocked up and anchored down with earthquake ties and the such. So we couldn't attach it to the house anyway, even if we wanted to. To make the 5-foot separation for the east property line as well, so we have a 10-foot separation between the mobile home and then the 5-foot separation between the east boundary of the property. Okay, and with standard number 3, the owner made every effort to be in compliance with the municipal code due to the circumstances of the situation. I was aware, and I was trying to meet the criteria based on the size and the structure of the building and moving it into its location. If the homeowner could have placed a mobile home and future garage layout on this property to meet code, he would have done so and made every possible attempt. I would have made every possible attempt to stay within the setback requirements. The standard number 4, the property owner foresees no reason for the adjacent property owners to be affected in any way by granting of this variance now or in the future. I did do a survey. I went over and talked to 8 property owners adjacent, behind, and in front of, off of West 80th. And then the other street, I don't have the name of that street, but it's directly behind our parcel, which is Lot 1, Block 38. And they had no objections at all. I showed them the as-built, the proposed garage, the whole thing, the pictures and everything, and none of them had any objections, and they signed the petition that I sent out. So I got a sample of that in the neighborhood. Also on standard 5, the property owner is aware and foresees no change in the appearance or character of the zoning district in question. It's such a small it encroaches 34 inches or 2.7 feet. It's really hardly noticeable in comparison to some of the other like, for example, the mobile home adjacent to me must have been grandfathered in, because I think he well encroaches well past what I'm asking for. So, but I think he was grandfathered in. Just to give you an example, he must be at least 4 or 5 feet over, I would say. I had to take a tape measure and measure it, but that curvature goes farther up the hill, and that adjacent mobile home seems to exceed that by quite a distance. And so the owner is aware and will remain in compliance with what is permitted with the district she lives in as a result of the granted variance in question. And then for standard 6, in no way does the property owner foresee any of the before-mentioned concerns affecting any of those conditions, the health, the safety, or welfare to the people of the municipality of Anchorage, which basically pretty straightforward there. Don't anticipate seeing anything there. And then standard number 7, the owner's response is the property owner realizes this is a deviate from the code. However, the 34 inches or 2.7 feet is only a small percentage of the setback frontage and would have no impact on any neighbor's character of his or her property in the immediate area. As it is, the building is approximately 40 feet from the edge of the road. Now, I went directly from the center of the mobile home as it faces south to the edge of the pavement off West 80th, just with a tape measure, and I got approximately 40 feet. That's how I came up with that number. The intent of the land use would not change, nor does the owner have any intent to violate the permissions set forth by the zoning district. And the other departmental agencies involved comments were as such. There was really no objections, except the Development Services Department Right-of-Way Division stated that on the proposed plot plan for the garage, that the driveway was in excess, and I think when I had talked to Mr. Barrett at another time, he said it can't exceed 2/5 of the area of the lot, I believe, and that was a preliminary plot plan. That isn't complete yet. That will be submitted when the time is necessary to submit it to get authorization for to go ahead on the construction of the garage. So basically with that, I am open to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Teneptis. Is there any questions of the applicant by the board or by staff? Any of the board members have any questions? Seeing none, thank you. Bear with me a second.
Sure.
I've got off. Haven't done this in so long.
Mr. Chair, there are some cheat sheets up there.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Rowan. With that, I believe we will close the public. I'm sorry. We will open the. You can have a seat, Mr. Teneptis.
Okay. Thank you.
Stay close. We'll open the hearing up for public testimony. Is there anyone from the public wishing to testify? Anyone at all? Seeing none, the public hearing is closed. Does staff have any rebuttal? Thank you, Mr. Barrett. Mr. Teneptis, now that you've made the long walk back to your chair, do you have any rebuttal? It was a short public opening testimony. He's indicated that he has no rebuttal. With that, the matter rests with the board. I apologize for stumbling as I did. Could I have a positive motion from the board member regarding this case? Mr. Burkhart, you've indicated you'd make the motion?
Yes. In case 2010-046, I move that we grant a variance from AMC 21.40.070.G to allow an existing residential structure to encroach the 20-foot front yard setback by approximately 2.7 feet, to allow a setback of 17.3 feet and encroachment of 13.5%, subject to department recommendations 1, 2, and 3 on page 7 of the packet.
Thank you, Mr. Burkhart. Mr. Fink, you've indicated you would second that motion?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Fink. Mr. Burkhart, would you speak to your motion?
I guess I concur with staff in that I think all 7 standards are essentially met here. And since I concur with that, I don't necessarily feel the need to enumerate those in detail, and I'll rely upon staff's verbiage in the record.
Thank you, Mr. Burkhart. Mr. Fink.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And like Mr. Burkhart, I think staff did a really good job on this, and I concur with it and adopt it by reference. I don't see a need to go through it all again. Mr. Barrett's put it on the record, and I think it adequately establishes that the standards are substantially met. So I'll be supporting the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Fink. Are there any other comments? Yes, Mr. Rowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I intend to support the motion as well, but for the record, would like to thank Mr. Teneptis for his diligent and comprehensive response and testimony. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Rowan. Mr. Burkhart?
I do want to make one comment. Looking at page 45 of the packet, shows the future garage. Shows it being exactly 5 feet off the side property line. The garage is 28 feet in width, and there's the bare minimum of 10 feet between the garage and the structure. And so, in the interest of you not coming back before this board again, that you're relying on zero tolerance for error in the placement of your garage. And so I guess I just caution you that make sure you got a good surveyor out there who properly locates that. If there's the garage is on an angle with the property line or an angle with the house, that you might be within those minimum separations there. So we don't want to see you here again here unnecessarily. So.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Burkhart. Are there any other comments from any of the board? Seeing none, please vote. That motion passes by a vote of 7-0. I would like to read that any party aggrieved by this decision has 30 days to appeal to Superior Court. The 30-day appeal period commences to run upon the mailing of the written decision. That brings us to our last case of the evening, case 2010-044. The applicant is Nancy Smith. The owner, Justin Gum, the representative. I think I saw a wave of the hand. The representative is indicated he's here. Mr. Barrett, would you provide us with the sufficiency of notice, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The property was advertised and posted. 50 public hearing notices were mailed. We received back 2 in support, plus the applicant supplied several letters of support.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett. Would you proceed with your presentation?
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This property is in Girdwood. It's up near the Crow Creek Mine. Girdwood has some slightly different yard setbacks than we're used to. The normal setback from a rear yard is 20 feet. However, if an owner or builder is able to add 5 feet to the front yard setback, increasing it from a 20-foot front yard setback to 25 feet set to a 25-foot front yard setback, he's able to reduce the rear yard setback by that offsetting amount. So a rear yard doesn't always have to be 20 feet. Sometimes it can be 15. And that is indeed what has happened in this case. Although the legal setback is 20 feet, the applicant is being measured against a 15-foot rear yard setback because he has offset the house much more than an additional 5 feet on the front setback. The as-built is shown on page 3 and a couple of photos on page 4. The applicant has a single-family home. According to property appraiser records, it was built in 2007. The only structure permit we can find is a retroactive building permit from August of last year for the house. The applicant purchased the property in May of 2006. There are well and septic permits from 2006, 7, and 8. They will need to be closed out as part of this variance. The house construction is complete and the house is occupied. Jump right to the standards. Standard number 1, that there exist exceptional or extraordinary physical circumstances, such as, but not limited to, streams, wetlands, slope, etc. This is substantially met. This property is beyond the area of our topographic maps, and we don't have any elevations spotted on the as-built. However, just from casual observation, it appears that the property is at least in the neighborhood of 20%, and we know for a fact that the septic system is installed on a slope of 13%, and that had to be cut so that it was not quite so steep. So we do believe that there is a slope affect to the property. Further, all of this property is within the highest risk avalanche zone. The owner has placed the house in a corner of the lot, kept the footprint small, and done what he is able to protect it by trees and other natural features. Now, although the slope and the avalanche danger are not peculiar to this property, this is an extreme enough situation that the department believes the standard is met. Standard 2, because of the physical circumstances, strict application of the code would create an exceptional hardship. This is substantially met. There are physical issues affecting the property, and although they're not unique, they do appear to have created the need for the variance. Attempting to move the fully constructed home from what appears to be the most protected location on the lot would create an undue hardship. And referring to the area map on page 2 in your package, you can see where the property is located at the end of Annex Circle off of Crow Creek Road. The property in the little triangle is down, the house in the triangle in the property is down in that lower right-hand corner, and you will notice everything to the south is zoned GW, which stands for Girdwood Watershed. These are federally owned, undevelopable lands, so it's not likely there's ever going to be a neighbor to the south of the subject property who would have any issues with this slightly shortened setback. Back to the standards. Standard number 3. I'm sorry, did I skip number 2? I got number 2. Standard number 3, thank you. The hardship is not self-imposed, and special conditions do not result from the actions of the applicant. This standard is not met, although there are physical issues directly related to the need for the variance. The house was built without first obtaining a permit. We can't say for certain if a variance could have been lessened or avoided if the applicant had obtained a permit first. We can't say that, but we do know the applicant would have at least been advised of the legal setbacks, and it might have been possible for him to do some repositioning of the house. Standard 4, if granted, will not adversely affect use of adjacent properties. The standard is substantially met. The property is at parity with the neighbors. Relocating the house at this point would add to slope issues. There'd have to be another foundation. There could be the removal of more trees. Drainage and runoff are not an issue here. The property most affected is unoccupied to the south of the subject property. The Girdwood Land Use Committee did issue a letter of non-objection to this requested variance. Standard 5, the variance, if granted, is in keeping with the intent of the code and does not change the character of the zoning district. The standard is substantially met. It's a dimensional request. It's a house with a fairly small footprint and does not negatively affect other homes in this zoning district. Standard 6 does not adversely affect health, safety, and welfare of the people of the municipality of Anchorage. Standard is substantially met. No identified health or safety issues, other than the obvious one that the house has been built in an avalanche zone, but that's not against the law. Standard 7, the variance granted is the minimum variance that will make possible a reasonable use of the land. The standard is substantially met. The encroachment is small. It's 5 feet. I have a typo in that line under Standard 7. It's not a 50% violation. It's a 33% violation because the required setback is now 15 feet. So the encroachment is relatively small, but still as a percentage it's fairly large, so we cannot call it de minimis. The house and deck footprint is very small, approximately 20 by 25 feet, 500 square feet. So in another sense, this is likely a minimal variance. The department must recommend for denial as Standard 3 is not substantially met, and I need to reword the paragraph under department recommendation. I have a couple of typos in there. I must have been reading from something else. So on page 9, under department recommendation, if after the public hearing the board establishes findings that the standards are substantially met to allow this 5-foot, not 1.5, this 5-foot encroachment into the 15, not 20, the 15-foot rear yard, not front yard, rear yard setback, the department recommends approval subject to the 2 conditions on page 9. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett. And just for clarification, do we typically reference a site plan that's submitted, a specific site plan? I see we have condition 1 that talks about an as-built being filed with the State of Alaska Recorder's District, but I thought I recall in previous cases, we typically reference a specific drawing. Is that?
Mr. Chair, I'm not following. Sometimes, if it appears an updated as-built might be required, we'll put that in, but for all intents and purposes on a project like this, I'm sorry, do you mean the plot plan?
Yeah.
Site plan?
For instance, I'm looking at the previous case, we had a third condition which talked about the specific, showing a 4-point, whatever our encroachment is, as shown on the as-built and the drawing submitted on, for instance, page 3 of this packet, prepared by such and such on this date. I'm just curious, was there a reason that that wasn't included as well?
Mr. Chairman, there wasn't one because the house was built with no permit. The first drawing of any type we have is an actual as-built showing the violation.
Okay. I see. An as-built being filed with the State of Alaska Recorder's Office. Will there be an as-built required to close out the building permit then? And if so, how will that be referenced?
That's part of the normal CO process, and Code Enforcement Officer Michael Billmeyer, whose area this is, will be doing a final, and he'll verify with an as-built before the CO is issued.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Croft.
Yes, Mr. Barrett, the dimension of 10 feet that we're seeing on page 3, I was wondering about whether that was a dimension to the face of the building, to the edge of the roof. The portion of the building that's encroaching is a covered porch and a walkway, it appears.
Mr. Chairman, Ms. Croft, it's to the corner of the building. I couldn't get close enough to see if it is the roof to measure it. I suspect it is from the actual wall of the house. Other than that, I can't say.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Vig.
Mr. Barrett, the closest adjacent property is shown on page 3 is under the control of Chugach National Forest. Is that correct?
Mr. Vig, yes. The closest property is the one to the south.
And were they a recipient of the notices mailed out?
Absolutely.
And there were no comments received from the Chugach National Forest?
Correct. And I'll ask you to direct that to the applicant because I believe he did speak with a ranger about it.
Okay. And as near as I can tell from the photographs on page 4, it appears that the slope of the land is away from the boundary with the forest property, generally.
Generally.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Am I reading that right?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vig. Mr. Barrett, are there any other questions of staff by the board? Seeing none, would the applicant come forward, please? Would you state and spell your name for the record?
Justin Gumm, Justin-Gumm.
Thank you, Mr. Gumm. You have 10 minutes for your presentation.
Okay. First, I'd like to thank the board for allowing me to speak on this issue. Let me basically just give a background of what's going on, especially regarding the number 3, where I didn't get approved. We purchased this property in 2006. Basically, we had in mind when we did buy it that we might actually sell it, so we wanted to do everything right. We basically enlisted S&S Engineering right off the bat to help achieve that. We submitted all our paperwork to them, including as-built and site plans. They basically were dealing with everything that was involved with the Muni for us. When we did receive letters from the Muni, they were always about information needed or expiring permits. We would contact SNS, and they would deal with it, or they would tell us what we needed to do to get it corrected. In the last 4 years, Mike Billmeyer, the code enforcement, has been up in our neighborhood probably 2 or 3 times a year. Most of our neighbors up there do have a file open with him. We do not. We have also had the assessors up there for him, I think twice in the 4 years that I've been there. And basically the fact that we never received any type of warning or infraction letters kind of cemented to us that the permits, that we had all the necessary permits at the time. Basically, the first time I heard that we did not have the necessary permits was from Mike. We actually listed our house for sale on Craigslist, and he was our first respondent. He basically told us, hey, nice house, you can't sell that without it being permitted. I told him we did have the permits, but we were waiting on water samples or something like that to close them out. She responded, you never opened, that's when he first told us that we never opened the permitting process. This led to us basically understanding where we're at and the problems we had, and basically not having the permit, and then after going through that process, finding out about the line setback issue. SNS had been sending all our information to the on-site people. We were unaware that the land use permit had not been started and that they keep on-site separate from land use. When we were given all this information, I have a site plan from 06 that we gave, and it went to the on-site people, and I was under the impression that everybody got it. I'm a waiter, and my girlfriend waits tables and bartends. I'm not a builder. I should have known, or I should have checked, but we didn't do that. And there's that. And then if I guess just go through these questions. The first one, I think he pretty much covered 1 and 2 pretty strongly. Feel we're good there. When it comes to number 3, I'd just like to say, even if we would move this house 5 feet, we're moving it into an avalanche. I mean, we're all in an avalanche terrain there. But as I'll go through some pictures, you can see that our house is right on the cusp of the pine trees, and we do have like a ridge that kind of feeds the pine trees. And we kind of pushed ourselves in there. And the thing is, even if we move 5 feet, that would make us more susceptible to avalanches, because this actually has ripped out in the last, I think 12 years ago was the last one that went through this area. It would also increase the possibilities, if our house did get hit, that the debris might adversely affect the properties below us. And then, I lost my place. And then also, just Mr. Barrett's explanation of the number 2, where he said attempting to move this fully constructed home from what appears to be the most protected location on the lot, which it is, would create an undue hardship, which kind of contradicts number 3 a little bit to me. Number 3, we have a serious avalanche issue. If I could move the house, I'd rather move it closer into the encroachment, really. And then even if we did have to move it out, I think I'd probably be back here again trying to get it so we can push it back through, push it back in to where it was. And then I think I have different page numbers than you guys have, but I have where I went to Girdwood LU Seaboard, and which he already stated that they said they had no objections to the variance. Let me just go through these pictures real quick. I've got them on page 38, the ones that I submitted. There's 3 of them in a row. It shows, the first one at the top is all red. Basically shows that the whole thing's in an avalanche condition. This pinker area is basically where it's not as bad of an area, and this actually would kind of come up a little bit, because as you'll see in some pictures, there's like a V of trees. I mean, it's not included, but I think this is just like a ballpark where it should be. Next picture down just shows you a lot. You can see that very bottom corner, all this is scrub alders, except for these bigger trees here on the end of that, right down that corner. And then this bottom one just shows you we have Ragged Top Mountain basically right above us, and it shoots out right towards us. The next pictures are just basically the top and bottom picture are the same. I just kind of colored in on the bottom one. This is kind of trying to show that slope that we do have there. You can see the house is the little orange dot there. Where we feel, I guess, the safe area is we have these trees, and we're just right on the edge of these trees. And you can see the avalanche path pretty clearly in front of our house here. And then that's the road coming up. The next group of pictures are just showing up and down right outside pretty much our house. You can see that it's just scrub brush down towards the road, and scrub brush basically going straight up towards Ragged Top. Next pictures, they're basically both the same. They're looking straight at our property. You can see there's scrub brush, and then there's just those little bit of trees right there. There's not really that much room for movement out for us. The next pictures are just showing how we had to dig into this hill to get into this area. And the next ones are more of the summer pictures. It kind of shows the same thing, that we had to dip in there to get into where we felt a little bit more protected. And then the next ones are having to do with the deck issue. No one's brought this up, but as in, like, the house is 10 feet away, but there is that deck there. These are just trying to show that they're at grade level. We've dug in, so it seems like it's higher, but it's maybe 8 feet above grade. I mean, in the next pictures too, I kind of tried to. You can see there's space under there, but it's lined up with the grade. And then the last pictures basically are just showing going down that grade into the house. And I don't know if you guys want to see them. I do have those site plans for 06 that we did give to the SMS engineer did give to on-site. I also have the first. We already said that we were dealing with on-site in 06. I have the one that just shows the perk test, and then just a paper that shows that we were using SNS and they billed us just to show that we were using them.
And Mr. Gum, you can submit those if you'd like. I have to tell you that we do have to retain a copy of those for 30 days for our file if you want to submit those. I don't know if those are your originals or if they're copies.
I made 10 copies because I wasn't sure who and what I was supposed to do with them.
Sure, you're more than welcome to submit those if you'd like.
Should I just hand them out to you?
Just hand them up here and we'll distribute them. And if you'd like to summarize your testimony, or if you have any further.
I think that's it. I'll take your questions.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Gum. 1 minute while we hand these out. Mm-hmm. Oh, I think we probably do have some on there, right? Huh?
These were headed this way. I'll take them down and we can kind of share them. Did you get one of these?
That's fine. No. You're back. Are there questions of the applicant? Mr. Vig.
Yes, Mr. Gum. Could you speak to any comments or conversations you had with the Forest Service?
Oh,
please.
Sorry. Yeah. I contacted the Forest Service, and they had no objections. Our number 4, our background versus National Forest. I talked to the National Forest representative. She stated as long as we were not on the National Forest land, they had no problem with what we were doing. She also was telling me she was told that they don't have any jurisdiction over what happens on property, and that's you guys. If I could I read number 7 real quick? What I put for that or no?
I'm sorry?
The 7, the variance get granted to. Can I read my answer to that one? Or?
Sure.
I put, due to the mountainous location of the subdivision, each lot is very unique, and usable portions of each property vary greatly from one lot to the next. Though our property is over an acre, the usable portion is very limited due to the avalanche issues. Other properties in the area that are under an acre have more usable area than we do and are not restricted by larger setbacks like we are. We could move the structure, but that would adversely affect the health, safety, and welfare of me and my family. Due to the fact that the only place we could move it would be closer towards the more prominent avalanche path. And like you were saying too, the slope there is, we had to kind of dig out that 13% for the septic, and everything else is pretty steep.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Gum. Ms. Croft, you had a question?
I did. I'm looking at the photos on page 43 there, and I was wondering that if the house were moved further north, so to actually have 15 feet where you needed to, that would put the house, well, I'm just trying to reconcile that with the photos I'm seeing here. It looks as if the house, if it were pushed further north, would that be putting it into a steeper slope? It looks as if when you hit the trees there on that upper picture, as if the ground sort of drops off over there. Is that true?
We kind of dug it in. It does get steeper there, for sure. That was trying to protect it a little bit more. We dug it in, and there's actually, where you see the back of that truck right there, it's actually pushed up probably like 2 feet just to kind of propagate snow different areas than there. You could move it, you could move it north. You could move it north, but then you're still going to push it out farther. Because we thought about putting it where that truck is, and it just, there's a big, it's steep right beside it, and if something did come down, it wouldn't have anywhere to run. It would just hit right into the roof. Where this is, it kind of lets it flow a little bit more, because there's a little bit more room before the hit, I guess. Whereas if you're right up against that hill, it kind of can knock it straight over. And that was our issue with moving it back up. And that's the thing, too. You keep getting steeper and steeper. This drop-off here is probably like, I don't know, 5 feet, maybe 6. But once you get up here where the car is, it's, I don't know, 10, 14.
You're talking about the drop-off to the east or to the?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Croft. Mr. Rowland.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Grum, on the site plan you just submitted as an exhibit, there's a handwritten note with some arrows between what appears to be the initially proposed location of your septic tank running south 100 feet plus or minus from creek. Is there a creek behind the house on the Chugach property?
Yeah.
Okay.
That kind of forms the bump that we're on because it carved it out. So we have like a break if an avalanche comes behind us because it hits that creek and kind of rides that.
So does the creek run parallel to the property then?
Yeah, straight down the property line to the
off into the east and west?
Yeah.
Question for Mr. Barrett. Any comments from Watershed Management at all on this case?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vig, they'd be in the package. I do not recall them. And I would add that the variance is routed to them for the stream sign-off.
It's kind of seasonal. I don't know if that makes a difference or not.
No, it doesn't make a difference if it's even a drainage way. No, sir, I don't see any comments from them. If it's 100 feet, it's well over the separation district, though, so it shouldn't pose a problem in that sense. It might have posed a problem for development if it was negatively affecting the lot.
I see on page 18, Watershed Management has no comment on the case.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Follow-up question, Mr. Barrett. I may be unclear, confused. Is there a separation setback between watersheds and houses? And if so, what is it in this district?
Mr. Vig, what's your definition of a watershed?
Well, a creek.
Well, depending on when the lot was platted, when the property was built, there could be, I've seen them as small as 15-foot setback from a stream or a creek and as large as 100 feet. So yes, there is a setback, but this appears to be satisfactory, and Mr. Ellis would have looked at that.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett.
When I went through to get the permit, I had to go upstairs in the office.
Right.
Is that the guy? And he said there was nothing.
That's him.
Ms. Denny, you had a question?
I just had a question, Mr. Gum. Who built your house?
I did.
And you knew enough to build the house, but you knew you didn't have to apply for a building permit?
Well, no, because I'm a server. Like there's like a generator shed. That's the first thing I ever built. And then we built that little storage thing that was kind of like it came in a package. And then I just went to town on this. I've never built anything before this.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Denny. Mr. Gum, I have a question, and I'm actually struggling here a little bit to get my orientation and my mind wrapped around the topography out there. Maybe you could explain, and Mr. Barrett, we do not have any topographic map in our packet, do we?
That's correct, Mr. Chairman. It's beyond the area of our topos.
Okay. How about if let's go to page 3 of the staff packet, the as-built. Which direction, so on this sheet, north is up, which direction is the avalanche path?
I just don't know which one you're looking at. This one?
Yes, yes.
So
north is up on the, pointing to the top of the page.
Oh, yeah.
You might want,
where it shows the distance between the well and the wellhead?
Yes.
That's pretty much it.
So that's the direction of the avalanche.
Yeah.
From left to right on the page. Hold on. This is up, yeah. Left to,
yeah.
That's the direction there.
It comes from the left to the right.
Left to right, yeah.
That picture on page 39, where it's just the picture of it, like I said, you can see where I have the top yellowish, that's kind of where it breaks off, and then it feeds down through that skinny area, and then the debris field is basically where it's all altered. That's why there's no trees there, because it's been...
Yeah, and either my eyes are, well, I know my eyes are bad, but my copy's not that great on that page 39, so...
Yeah. I have a color one.
Mine's a color copy.
Oh.
Anyone else have any? Well, that's okay. Everyone else can ask their own questions. Let's go back to that. So the picture, I believe, on, I'm just wanting to make sure I'm oriented correctly, that I believe you were discussing with Ms. Croft. Where was that picture with the driveway? Oh, there we go. Page 43. So the top picture on page 43 then is looking, I'm assuming it's looking roughly east? Is that?
Yeah, which way is it looking? It's looking, yes, east, southeast-ish almost, a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so we're basically following the path. We're kind of in line with the avalanche path,
Yeah,
more or less.
we're kind of, yeah, because how you can see these trees in front of that house, how they've kind of been a little bit warped. There's not tree branches down the whole way on the tree.
Mm-hmm.
The house behind, you can tell that behind, we cut down a bunch of trees to get here. The trees behind the house, you can see they're more grayish, as in like something's been cut out. Where these ones in the front, you can kind of tell this is kind of where some more snow has actually come more regularly, I guess. And there used to be a bump kind of right there too. We kind of took it out.
Mm-hmm. And I guess what I'm wrestling with, Mr. Gum, is the understanding. You thought you were following the proper procedure. You applied for, or you had your engineer apply for a septic permit. What they had prepared was not a plot plan. However, they showed a house in what I'm appearing was a conforming location. It was.
I think they were doing it for the septic purposes, and then they just kind of put that house in there.
Understood. I guess I'm having a hard time figuring out how moving it further to the north out of the encroachment would not be why a person can come before this board before the fact, after the fact, and whether or not the variance is granted, it stands on its own. But why, from my perspective, I'm trying to figure out why.
You could move it north, but you're not going to be able to go straight up. You're going to have to come out that 5 feet somewhere. And this lot actually bends back. It's not like a straight. Where's the? It's not a straight back line. I think I kind of. That looks like it's straight there. Yeah, it goes like this. I don't know, this has it coming like this, but that's not true. But still, I mean, you know.
Let me ask a question of you. Staff has found, it sounds like standard 3 has not been met according to staff, and you've heard, and it's probably a condition or a concern that's going to be raised where there's no problem with someone building their own house. But
this is a land use area.
It is a land use area where you don't need to get a full building permit, but you still need to abide by the code. Whether you're here before or after the fact, it doesn't concern me as much, but I guess I'm looking for a little bit more input from you on why that standard 3 is met and why if you were coming here before you built this house, you'd want to put it in its present, in the location where it is.
Well, our major issue is basically with the slope of the lot, and basically with the avalanche issues. Mm-hmm. Where I was looking at that 3 and how it says explain it, you must explain why you need the variance due to circumstances that are beyond your control. The slope and avalanche issues to me aren't in my control. I mean, I could move it out. We could move it out a little bit, but it's just going to be in worse shape. I mean, 5 feet doesn't seem like a lot, but I mean, in these pictures, I don't know if these pictures even justify, I'd rather be flush with the back line,
And I'll ask one last question, then stop. On page 3 again, on that sheet, there's something called, there's a berm and then the ditch. Is that berm something that was built at some time? Is that an avalanche, a buffer from the avalanche? This is the Centec plot plan. Is that kind of the intent of that berm?
Yeah.
So, okay, and I'm not, so by moving it south, you're getting it further, you're providing more buffer left to right from the berm?
Yeah, because that's true too. It's a pretty weak berm when it comes. It's pretty steady above those trees, but then we couldn't get enough fill to really make it that substantial after those trees. And we got to realize too, I mean, it's not like a straight. There's like different avenues that different avalanches has come through, where the trees aren't as thick above this, because it was kind of like a point. You know what I mean? Like we kind of dug right into this point, and there's a water. Everyone gets their water out of this creek because it's spring, and this is off the grid. This is off grid housing. It's inholding inside the national forest up there. Everyone's off the grid. Everyone uses this culinary water back here. Probably like 14 or 15 people pull water off here. But this has actually been taken out a couple times. But it's not coming over the berm that I'm talking about. So that's why we try to put it kind of right on top of that thing, just to give us a little more protection. I mean, like I said, if it's like one of those 3-4 feet snow days, I'm not staying at my house. You know, we get a hotel room or we're not there. We are in that whole area is a major issue. It's just where we felt, and the whole thing too, that 10 feet setback, like I'm under an acre, I'm over an acre. I mean, if my property is under an acre, I can be 10 feet from this thing. You know, my neighbors right below me, their lot's smaller than mine, but they have much more usable area, and they can be right beside me 10 feet away, and I have to be 15 feet. You know, and really this lot, I can only use, I don't know, like 0.3 acres of this, maybe, like buildable. I mean, it's great for the summer. We have a garden here and this and that, but for building purposes, this is pretty much it. And in that reference to that 15 to 10 feet thing, I mean, and that's why we built it there too. This add-on, it's actually an Arctic entryway. And instead of it being 8 by 10, it's 7.5 by 10. Because I was under the impression it was supposed to be 10 feet. I mean, I had some guy come out and actually measure this. I had him blaze the line and then mark off exactly. Actually, it was like 10 feet, 6 inches, and I messed up, and I'm at exactly 10 inches, at 10 feet. I did everything I could not to encroach. But when I read the regulations, everyone was telling me 10-20, 10-20, 20 feet from your sides, 10 feet from back and front. And that goes, like the GRN2 actually changed over, the regulations changed over the year that we started, or the year after we started building. But I mean, it's my duty to go find out what the regulations were. And I did look, but I had that in mind. I looked down, and it's not really straightforward, and I hit it, and I saw the 10 feet, and I just kept going. I didn't look any farther. And that's what I've been going off of the whole time. I mean, this addition actually, we just did that a year and a half ago. So I was fully under the idea that A, it was 10 feet, and B, we were fully permitted to do this stuff. As she stated before, I mean, didn't I know they'd come do that or come get my permits? Everything I got from the Muni, I talked to SNS. I'm like, and I'm not blaming them either. It's not their fault. I mean, it's my fault. But I mean, I talked to Mike too, and he was up here last summer, and he asked me, he's like, hey, is your house, you got all your permits? I'm like, oh, yeah, I do. Because I thought I did. And I talked to him too, because once this happened, he said, well, you need to get this fixed. It's like, yeah, I'm trying to do it as fast as I can. And so he keeps checking up on me, I guess, to make sure that I'm going through this process.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mr. Gum. Are there other questions of the applicant? Does staff have any questions? Mr. Barrett.
A couple of items. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Regarding Ms. Croft's very initial question about the not the scale as built on page 3, is that 10-foot setback measured from the roof overhang or from the house. After looking at more of the photos and the full-size copy of the as-built to scale, I can pretty confidently say that 10-foot setback measurement is from the wall of the house. So there is a bit more of an encroachment because the roof eave does appear to be a little longer than 2 feet. And then for Mr. Gum, I would ask, just so we don't have a future issue in another area, in the 2006 drawing from SNS for the on-site systems, is what was shown as the on-site septic system and holding tank and the drain fields, is that essentially what was built, so that when there's a final closeout inspection, there's not a problem there?
It's a little bit moved. It's the final one's on the final one that's in the booklet that you guys sent out. As far as that goes, too, they called me for water samples, which had already been taken a couple months ago, and they told me everything's okay now for that. What they told us.
Does that answer your question, Mr. Barrett?
Yes, thank you.
With that, we'll open the hearing for public testimony. Is there anyone from the public wishing to testify? Would you please state and spell your name for the record?
My name is Joshua Cropper, J-O-S-H-U-A-C-R-O-P-P-E-R.
And, I'm sorry, Cropper? Okay, thank you, Mr. Cropper. You have 3 minutes.
Okay, my property is adjacent to Mr. Gum's property, and he actually has reported me to the municipality for violations having a tent on my property. So I think it's kind of ironic that he's here asking for leniency due to the fact of being too close to a national forest or recreational area. At the same time, I don't necessarily have a huge problem with it, but I do want the petitioner to be aware that that is a hunting and trapping and recreational piece of property behind his. And he's been very stout on not letting people encroach on his property when it comes to accessing the national forest. So as he is asking for permission to be too close to the national forest, he also needs to be aware that hunting and that type of activity will be going on. And it's kind of unfair to ask for leniency on your behalf as you are so stout on enforcing trespassing, reporting people for violations, things like that. So it's just something to bring up as far as my perspective on being his neighbor and having very difficult times dealing with him, telling me where I can park, where I can't park. You're on my property. You're 10 feet on my property on a piece of property that's I'm way out 300 feet away from his home or something like that. So there is issues from a neighborly aspect where I've basically been run off and have $40,000 tied up because of issues with the neighbor and being reported for code violations for having a tent on my property. People are going to be using that area, the national forest. There is going to be a house staring right at them. So those are some things to consider. And that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Mr. Cropper. Are there any questions of the yes, Mr. Burkhart?
What lot number is the one that you own?
Lot 6.
Okay, so you're directly to the west.
Unfortunately, I found out about this public hearing on Sunday. So I don't have very much information to present, but it's directly next to his property.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Burkhart. Are there any other questions? In your lot, do you have a home situated? Is there a building on your lot?
I had a yurt, which is a tent. Okay. You can set it up in a day, and I was reported for code violations for having that, even though it doesn't require any permitting within Anchorage. Since it is a land use permit, they are under the assumption that it requires land use permits, even though it doesn't fall under the building permit, which is the purpose of having the land use permit, is to take place of the permitting outside of the land use area, out of the building area.
Okay, so let me rephrase my question. Do you live there year-round?
No, I've had to leave because of the violations that I was reported for.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions? Thank you, Mr. Cropper, for your time. Is there anyone else from the public wishing to testify? Anyone at all? Seeing none, the public hearing is closed. Does staff have any further rebuttal?
Just a question, Mr. Chairman. The previous speaker, that was Mr. Joshua Cropper. All right. I just wanted to, Mr. Cropper said he hadn't found out about it until this past Sunday. I just wanted to make sure that he was on the mailing list and was properly notified. And based on what I have in front of me, he would have been notified back when the items were first mailed, which was March 16th. So I can't explain why he didn't find out about it till Sunday. Thank you.
Okay.
There is no mail service, sir, but unless you purchase a post office box.
You'll have to speak into the microphone if you want to be heard on the record.
One of the reasons is because there is no mail service in Girdwood unless you purchase a post office box. There's no community mailboxes at all throughout the entire area, and I don't have a post office box, so I have a mailing address in Anchorage, which I don't live in Anchorage. So, and the public notice, I go to Girdwood a lot. the public notice is at the very end of a road, so unless I'm actually going to my property, I won't see that public notice.
Right, but that explains it, Mr. Chairman. The notice was mailed to 2006 Tudor Hills Court, Anchorage.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Barrett. Any further rebuttal?
Not for me, thank you.
Mr. Gum, care to offer any rebuttal, please?
That was kind of left field for me. Yeah, I mean, me and Josh have had our issues for sure. You know, I have a well and septic system right below him, and basically what we reported him for is he put an outhouse in that he was pooping and peeing in, and he dug down like 5 feet. He's also had it rented all winter, so he hasn't been there, and the person that was staying there has been pooping and peeing in this until he actually left probably like a month and a half ago. But that was what that's why we, those were the violations that he has, I think. You know, I don't even know. Him coming on our property, people, like I said before, people use the water behind us. So we have people behind our property at least once a week, and we have no issue with that. I do have issue when he comes on our property. We've got that berm, and there's water in there. And like one day he was in there trying to hook up a water line to his house from on my property where the water comes down. I told him when he first moved, you know, I don't care what he does with his property, just on his property. I don't know what this has to do with. It's really with my case. I mean, I've got every other neighbor up there that's saying this is okay. I'm not the only one that's filed these complaints. If you want to complain, the neighbors beside me have filed complaints. Josh has actually shot at neighbors' dogs. I mean,
let's just focus on the case and the rebuttal on testimony. So,
I guess I feel that was a hostile witness. I guess I could put that. We have issues with each other for sure. He could say this about me. I could say that. I guess. I'd rather you guys go with the two people that emailed in, or the numerous other people who I had signed saying they had no issues with this variance. And we are a kind of like tight. Most of us are a tight-knit group up there. Yeah, and again, I would just like to say that the 10 feet for when I look at my property, I don't see a 1.7 acre house. I see a lot smaller just because due to the issues that I have to deal with and the little space that I have to deal with the build. Is there 5 feet here to move? I mean, you can move it, but are you going to be in more danger? And that was my problem. There's these spots I could be here, but this is obviously more dangerous than this. Even if you move it left or right, like north or south, you're still encroaching more out into that slide path. And not just the house, and then you're going to have to move your cars. So your cars are going to be moved back a little bit more off that house. So they're going to get you back into that area too. And then that all, if something did happen, is all going to be down on the neighbors below me. If something really did take out somebody else's house down there. We try to keep everything in those trees as much as possible. And like I said, if this isn't granted, I mean, we can move it out, but I'm probably going to be back here again trying to get myself farther in there again. It's a difficult area. It's a difficult piece of property. I feel thankful that we do have the trees that some of the other lots don't have that we can use for protection. I just wish that, I wish I would have read the regs right, and I wish I would have a little more similarity with my neighbors. Like my neighbor right below me is allowed to be 10 feet, where where I can't be. But I guess the whole roof issue, I had no clue about the roof issue. So I guess I am a little bit farther in. But yeah, I'd have to cut that roof off to do that.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mr. Gum. With that, the matter rests with the board, and I'd like a positive motion, please, from the board member. The screen is lighting up. Mr. Vig.
Mr. Chairman, in the case 2010-044, I move that in the GR2A district, we grant a variance from AMC 2109060B1, which requires a 15-foot rear yard setback when offset by adding 5 feet to the front yard setback for lots larger than 1 acre in size, to allow an existing single-family structure to encroach 5 feet. Subject to the department recommendations 1 and 2, as noted on page 9 of the staff packet, and as corrected for Mr. Barrett's earlier comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vig, and Mr. Burkhart, you have indicated you would second that motion?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Burkhart. Mr. Vig, would you care to speak to your motion?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Standard 1, extraordinary or exceptional physical circumstances of the subject property. I do agree with staff in the finding that this standard is substantially met. Obviously, from the photographs and other testimony that the lot is affected much by slope and in the high-risk avalanche zone, which I think severely limits the usable part of the property. Standard 2, because of these physical circumstances, strict application of this code would create an exceptional or undue hardship upon the property owner and would deprive the applicant of rights commonly enjoyed by other properties in the same district. I do agree with staff finding that is substantially met. Strictly applying the code would require the structure to be more within the avalanche zone in a more hazardous location, and apparently some of the adjacent properties that are under 1 acre in size currently are located approximately the 10-foot setback that the applicant is seeking. Standard number 3, the hardship is not self-imposed and special conditions and circumstances do not result from the actions. This is a tough one. Certainly there are a certain amount of self-imposed results here. I will be interested to hear what my fellow board members have to say about that standard, but it seems that because of the physical limitations of the lot and the existing conditions with the avalanche hazard, that although the home was built by the applicant in the location that it is, that there are very few alternatives for the home to be located on this lot. Standard 4, I agree with staff's finding that it's met, that it will not adversely affect the use of adjacent property. There's nothing in the record from the Chugach National Forest. We've heard from one adjacent property owner, and I don't think there were any injurious effects that he brought forward from his testimony. So I believe that standard's met. Standard 5, I don't believe it will change the character of the zoning district. It's a dimensional request, not a use variance. Standard 6 should not adversely affect health, safety, and welfare of the people of the municipality of Anchorage. I believe that is met, as staff has noted here. And whether the variance is in accordance with Standard 7, the minimum required that will make possible a reasonable use of the land. As Mr. Barrett noted, correcting his writings here, that it's a 33% of the required setback. But it is a fairly small in terms of the overall lot dimension on the south side. I think the amount of the encroachment as a percentage of the overall area back there is fairly small. I could see where that standard would be met. And so for those reasons, I'm tending to support the motion, but I'm struggling with standard number 3 a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vig. Mr. Burkhart.
I'd concur with Mr. Vig, and I guess I have the following comments to offer in terms of standard number 3. In regards to the hardship being self-imposed, we've have testimony from the petitioner that he was unfamiliar with the specifics in terms of permitting requirements, and may have been under the impression that the permits for the well and septic with S&S, might cover the building permit as well. So I think that's an extenuating circumstance that mitigates that to some degree. And that special conditions and circumstances do not result from the actions of the applicant, and such conditions and circumstances do not merely constitute inconvenience. And in my mind, the issue here is in terms of the avalanche danger and safety, and I think it's quite difficult to look at all the information here. A topo map would have given us, I think, a whole lot better clarity. But I look over to page 43 of the packet, which basically has a view of the house, kind of like the corner closest to the photograph is, I believe, the north corner of the house. And you can see as you go across the property from west to the east that it does drop off there, which seems to conflict with kind of like the ditch and the berm running in the northeasterly direction. But I believe from the topo or the aerial on page 11 in the package, and the testimony of the applicant, that really the house being built into the edge of the trees is essentially the fall line and the avalanche danger. So I am convinced that, like I said, I would be very happy to see a topo, but I believe that, yes, putting the house closer to the north property line is a significant difference in terms of mitigating that avalanche danger. It would have been nice in a perfect world if this was a before the fact variance than an after the fact variance, and that we had topo data on the site also. But what I see leads me to believe that, yeah, the avalanche danger is very real here, and that it is a much safer location, being tucked closer to the north property line. And for that reason, I think it's the condition and circumstances really here are the topography. So I think in that reference that standard 3 is at least partially met, if not fully met.
Thank you, Mr. Burkhart. So you intend to support the motion? You
Yes, I believe so.
Thank you, Mr.
But I'd like to hear additional comments from other board members as well.
Thank you, Mr. Burkhart. Mr. Rowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Vig, thank you for presenting the motion. I, as well, was initially conflicted with Standard 3 and having difficulty in finding argument for it being at least partially met. And luckily, it was recently revealed to myself a few arguments that may be worth discussing. And as Mr. Burkhart alluded to, I wish also that this were a before-the-fact request. And if it were a before-the-fact request, how would I weigh in on my decision, and what considerations would I make? Well, I would put greater emphasis on the owner's preference in locating his house on this lot. I'm not an avalanche expert. The whole area, to me, is something that I wouldn't necessarily want to live in. If the owner is willing to take that risk, he should have certain leniency and weight given to the location of his house on that lot. And similar to what Mr. Burkhart did in looking at the aerial on page 11, it just seems like the logical location to me. It's unfortunate that the petitioner has a lot that's over an acre in size and yet has such little buildable land. But given those considerations, I can find that Standard 3 is at least partially met and intend to support the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Rowan. Are there any other comments from any board members? Ms. Croft.
I just want to, I intend to support the motion. I just wanted to point out that having the Chugach forest behind the lot, though, is also something that makes me less concerned about it being that close to a property line, that we're not up against another property with a possible house being built there. So I think that adds some additional weight.
Thank you, Ms. Croft. Any other comments from any of the board members? I just weigh in. I believe that I'd echo the comments and thought processes of both Mr. Big and Mr. Burkhart. And I also wrestled with the standard number 3. I'd like to. I doubt this is something that the petitioner is going to be the process you're going to be going for in the future, but I had to struggle quite a bit with this case, I think, from a lack of information. Had to make some inferences that could have been helped. While I appreciate your pictures and you did go to some effort, it was difficult to get from A to Z for me. And again, I find that standard 3, while the need for the variance is the result of the applicant of the actions of the property owner, I concur with staff in their last sentence on finding standard number 2 that attempting to move the fully constructed home from what appears to be the most protected location of the lot would create an undue hardship, just like that. So I don't feel that it just merely, the circumstances don't merely constitute an inconvenience. It is a safety standard. And regarding standard 7, again, the 33% variance isn't a minimum, but the total impact to the setback is really only about 1% by area if you look at the total area of that setback along that south property line. And I believe that just kind of a follow-up on Mr. Vig's comment. So for that reason, I intend to support the motion. Are there any other comments from any board members? If not, please vote. That motion passes by a vote of 7-0. I must read for the record, any party aggrieved by this decision has 30 days to appeal to Superior Court. The 30-day appeal period commences to run upon mailing of the written decision. That is the last case of the evening. Moves us on to our reports section of the agenda. I guess my report is we are, well, first off, I must apologize for my how I handled the last two cases. I was a little shaken by following Mr. Ron and Mr. Ron's footsteps. I saw the future and was amazed. So he did an excellent job again.
Do we have a chance to reconsider our elections and get rid of the stiff we have as the chair right now?
Well, in the chairman's defense, I'm sure he's not watching game tapes after the board meetings, and I've had the advantage of watching the chair for 2 years now and picked up a few tips along the way.
Yeah. But we're still looking for one more board member. We're at 8, possibly 7, with Ms. Souzo's position, I guess, or what her status is.
I don't have anything firm, Mr. Chairman, on Ms. Souzo, except that from Gloria Stewart's conversations with her, it does sound as though we'll be losing her.
Okay. We're kind of in an unfortunate state, and I'm going to pick on Mr. Fink a little bit here because when I started, or at times we've had as many as I believe 4 or 5 attorneys, and I think we're down to 1 right now. And while the meetings go a lot quicker, I think there's something to be said about picking up maybe a few more. Well, and I know I spoke to someone in the back. I think I was brought into the board by a phone call from the person that I replaced, and I think, Mr. Burkhart, you said you crossed paths with someone, and that's how you ended up on the board. But I guess as board members, if we can do anything to help increase our numbers as well, I think everyone would benefit, and I think the board in particular would benefit. The existing board members would benefit from having a fully constituted board.
I ran into Jeff Dunham about 6 months ago, and I think we had a vacancy then, and he said he had some interest in serving on the board, that he had just gotten through a period of, I guess, being busy or personal commitments, but he thought that he indicated to me that he might be willing to serve if asked. And so he's still working for DOT, so I'm sure you can find his contact information through there.
I don't believe I have any other comments. Are there any other comments by any of the board members? Are there 2? Well, no, we have 2 architects. And what would we classify? What pigeonhole would you like to be put into? Construction. You're just so articulate, Joanne.
Guilt by association.
Mr. Barrett, how does next month look? That's true. Yeah, it does.
May 13th, we have 2 variances and a reconsideration. That'll be interesting. The reconsideration is one, was not from a board member. It was from the applicant filing with the muni clerk within 15 days as required by code. So let's see, those packages will be going out about the 7th of May or so.
So who was the applicant, or what was the reconsideration?
The case was fairly recent. It was only denied back in February. The owner's name is Margie Runser. She had a home that encroached 100% into a side yard setback and actually went across the lot line a bit. I believe it was a carport that had been converted to a garage that had had a new roof. It was a little complicated, some of the explanation, and the planning department's report and the nonconforming determination from the land use section were a little bit at odds with each other. So that'll all be laid before you next month for the determination as to whether you wish to reconsider it.
I was absent for that meeting, so how does my participation come into this?
Since this would be a vote just on the reconsideration, it's going to mean listening to the minutes and all, and then voting for the reconsideration, and if it comes back in June, you'd be fully able to participate in a vote.
But he can vote, Mr. Big, as long as he listens to the case tape, he can vote on the reconsideration.
Yes, so he brings himself up to speed just as he would on anything else.
And is that now available online?
I'll send you an email tomorrow or Monday with the link attached reminding you.
Can't decide if I want to do that or my taxes for.
Okay. Any other comments? If not, we are adjourned then.